Hi, welcome to my channel. I have a new story for you today.
My name is Julia Hayes. I am 34 years old, and right now I am standing in a sterile, windowless room on the fourth floor of Chicago Memorial Hospital, listening to a machine breathe for the man I have hated every single day for the last 10 years. The room smells like iodine, cheap industrial bleach, and something underlying that is fundamentally broken. It is a scent you only recognize if you have spent time in intensive care units. The smell of time running out. I am wearing a $3,000 bespoke cashmere overcoat. There is a black town car idling downstairs in the freezing rain. Racking up a meter I do not even have to track. I am the chief executive officer of a data analytics firm based in Austin, Texas. I have 200 employees, venture capital, backing a penthouse, overlooking the Colorado River, and a stock portfolio that guarantees I will never have to worry about the price of anything ever again. I built every single inch of that sprawling empire out of pure, unadulterated spite. 10 years ago, the frail, shrunken man hooked up to those monitors, looked me dead in the eye and threw me out of his house like I was a bag of garbage. He told me I was a selfish drain on our family. He told me a daughter who refused to conform to his rigid expectations was entirely useless. He gave me 12 hours to pack up my childhood and leave. I walked out into a freezing Illinois winter with $300 in my checking account and a single canvas duffel bag, fueled by a deep, dark promise that I would make him regret those words. I swore I would build a life so big, so undeniably successful that my shadow would completely suffocate him. For an entire decade, I did not call. I did not text. I did not send a single holiday card. When prominent investors in my professional circles asked about my family background, I told them my parents died in a tragic accident. It felt significantly truer than explaining the alternative. I became a ghost to them, and I turned them into ghosts in return. I assumed they were living their comfortable blue-collar lives, sitting around the same heavy oak dining table, laughing about the failure of a daughter. They had the good sense to cut loose. I spent 10 years winning a relentless argument against a man who was not even in the room. And I was winning. I had won definitively. Standing here today in my tailored designer clothing, looking at a man who cannot even open his own eyes, I should be feeling the ultimate vindicating triumph. This should be the exact moment where the villain of my story is finally brought low, and I get to stand above him as the undisputed victor. But I do not feel triumphant. I feel like the floor has permanently dropped out from beneath me. I feel like I cannot draw a full breath because exactly 12 hours ago, before I arrived at this clinical facility, I drove to my childhood home to locate his life insurance paperwork. I walked into his old, dusty study. I found a hidden brass key taped securely beneath his computer keyboard. I unlocked the heavy bottom drawer of his oak desk. I did not find a standard insurance policy. What I found instead shattered the reality I have lived in for the past 650 days. I found a secret so enormous, so profoundly agonizing, that it took the foundational story of my life, the story of the unwanted scapegoat who pulled herself up by her bootstraps and burned it down to the absolute bedrock. Before I tell you exactly what was inside that locked wooden drawer and the terrifying truth it revealed about why I was really kicked out into the snow, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. But only if you genuinely connect with stories about the complicated, messy truth of family. Drop a comment below telling me your location and what time it is where you are right now. I want to know who is listening and where you are in the world as we go through this journey. Because the story I am about to tell you is not just about how a young woman built a multi-million-dollar software company from the backseat of an outdated sedan. It is about the terrifying realization that the monster you spent your entire life running away from might have been the absolute only person standing guard at the door. To explain how everything broke apart and how a locked drawer put it all back together, I need to take you back to a Tuesday night in 2016. The night I became a permanent exile. The memory of how my entire universe fractured begins on a brutally cold Tuesday evening in late February 2016. The Illinois winter was dragging out its final miserable weeks. It was the kind of relentless freezing weather that seeps through the glass window panes and makes the wooden floorboards ache under your feet. I was 22 years old. I was sitting in my childhood bedroom with the door firmly shut. The harsh blue light of my computer monitor illuminated the cramped space, casting long shadows against the walls. I had graduated from a state university 8 months prior with a degree in computer science. While my female classmates were accepting comfortable entry-level corporate jobs in downtown Chicago, settling for small cubicles and steady, predictable salaries, I had moved back into my parents' house. I was attempting to build a highly sophisticated predictive software platform entirely from scratch. I wrote complex algorithms for 14 hours a day. I fueled my exhausted brain with cheap black coffee and sheer blind ambition. My eyes burned from staring at lines of code. But I refused to stop. To me, I was laying the digital foundation of a massive enterprise, but to the rest of the household, it just looked like I was lazily staring at a glowing rectangle. Avoiding the real world, my father, Arthur, did not understand glowing rectangles. He was a man constructed entirely out of physical labor. He spent 35 years working as a heavy machinist at a metal fabrication plant on the south side of the city. He measured a person's ultimate worth by the thick calluses on their palms and the dark grease permanently stained into their knuckles. He believed that if your back did not ache at the end of a shift, you had not contributed anything meaningful to society. It was a simple, rigid worldview. My mere existence as a digital creator, a young woman aspiring to run a technology company, was a direct violation of his core beliefs. I heard his heavy steel-toed boots hit the bottom of the wooden stairs. He always walked with a slight, heavy limp. It was a permanent souvenir from a workplace accident he stubbornly refused to complain about. Dinner was ready. I saved my code, shut my laptop, and walked downstairs into the lion's den. The dining room felt incredibly small that night. The air was thick with the scent of roasted chicken and boiling potatoes. Beneath those comforting domestic smells, a sharp metallic tension hovered over the table. My mother was already seated at the far end. She looked remarkably worn down. Her skin was pale, and she rubbed her temples with her fingertips. That was a gesture she made constantly over the previous few weeks. She barely touched the food on her ceramic plate. She was historically the designated peacekeeper of our home. She spent decades smoothing the rough, unpredictable edges of the volatile temper my father possessed. Tonight she offered no comfort. My younger brother Marcus sat across from me. He was 19 years old, taking a few general education classes at the local community college. His real focus was his full-time hourly job at a regional hardware supply store. He wore his scuffed work boots and a faded flannel shirt at the dinner table. He smelled faintly of fresh sawdust and motor oil. Marcus was exactly the kind of hard-working, pragmatic child my father easily understood. My father took his customary seat at the head of the heavy oak table. He did not ask how anyone was doing. He picked up his fork and knife, beginning to cut his meat with sharp, aggressive motions. The only noise in the room was the harsh scrape of stainless steel against the plates. It was the kind of agonizing quiet that warns you a grenade has just been unpinned and is currently rolling directly beneath your chair. He chewed, swallowed, and looked directly at Marcus. His rigid posture softened just a fraction. He asked Marcus how the supply store operations were running. Marcus sat up straighter, eager for the paternal approval. He explained that a massive shipment of lumber had arrived late, forcing him to stay an extra 2 hours, unloading wooden pallets by hand in the freezing loading dock. My father nodded slowly. A look of profound respect crossed his weathered face. He told Marcus that physical endurance was what real character looked like. He praised my brother for showing up, doing the heavy lifting, and earning an honest daily wage. Then my father slowly turned his head and locked his dark eyes onto me. The warmth vanished from his expression. It was instantly replaced by a cold, hard judgment that pinned me to the back of my wooden chair. He asked me what exactly I had accomplished today. I tried to keep my voice perfectly even. I told him I had finally debugged the core architecture of my database. I explained that I was weeks away from having a functional software prototype that I could pitch to seed investors. I spoke passionately, trying to translate the massive digital infrastructure I was building into terms a retired machinist might respect. He set his fork down. The sound echoed loudly in the small room. He told me he asked what I actually did, not what imaginary video games I played. A hot flush of defensive anger rose in my chest. I told him it was not a game. I explained that I was building a technology company and that the software industry required significant upfront development time before generating revenue. My father leaned forward, placing his heavy, scarred hands flat on the table. His voice dropped to a low, terrifying register. He said he was looking at a grown woman who believed she was too smart to sweat. He called me a parasite. He pointed a thick finger at my face and stated that I was sitting in a free room eating food paid for by his physical labor, while my younger brother broke his back lifting lumber. I looked desperately toward my mother, expecting her to intervene. I waited for her to diffuse the escalating situation, just like she always did. She did not look up. She kept her eyes glued firmly to her plate. A single tear escaped her eyelid and dropped silently onto her paper napkin. She refused to look at me. Her maternal refusal was a physical blow to my stomach. It was a silent declaration of surrender. I tried to explain myself again, but my father raised a hand, cutting me off instantly. He said he was entirely done funding my pipe dreams. He said my selfishness was draining the life out of our family. He refused to watch me turn into a lazy, entitled failure under his own roof. The next sentence he spoke altered the trajectory of my entire existence. He told me I had until the oxygen in the room evaporated. I sat frozen, waiting for the cruel punchline, waiting for the sudden surge of anger to recede. But his eyes were utterly dead. He meant every single syllable. I looked across the table at Marcus. Desperate for a sibling ally, Marcus picked up his water glass, took a slow sip, and deliberately shifted his gaze to the living room wall. He had chosen the path of least resistance. He was the good, hard-working son, and he was not going to risk his favorable standing to defend the outcast daughter. In that one agonizing moment, the true dynamic of my family crystallized with terrifying clarity. I was completely alone. I was the designated failure, the scapegoat they could freely project all their frustrations onto. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw my plate across the room. I simply stood up. My chair scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. I looked at the three people I had spent my entire life loving, realizing they did not want me anymore. I walked away from the table. I walked upstairs to my bedroom. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the metal zipper of my canvas duffel bag. I did not pack nostalgic memories. I did not pack photo albums or childhood keepsakes. I packed raw survival gear. I threw in my laptop, my heavy charging cables, a thick winter coat, and 5 days' worth of warm clothes. I pulled out my cell phone and opened my mobile banking application. My available balance was exactly $314. That was the absolute sum total of my financial safety net. I slung the heavy duffel bag over my shoulder. I walked back down the wooden stairs. The dining room was empty. The plates had been cleared away. The house was totally silent, as if I had already ceased to exist within its walls. No one came out of the kitchen to say goodbye. No one stood by the front door to beg me to stay or to offer a reasonable compromise. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the freezing night. The icy wind hit my face like a physical strike. I walked down the concrete driveway, listening to the snow crunch beneath my boots. I did not turn around to look at the house. I walked toward my beat-up sedan parked on the street, gripping my keys so tightly the metal bit into my palm. I was unaware of the brutal, humiliating struggle that was waiting for me just across the state line. I was a young woman, cast out into the freezing wilderness, unprepared for the terrifying crucible of poverty that would forge me into a corporate weapon. I drove south through the endless American Midwest, gripping the steering wheel of my battered sedan until my knuckles turned completely white. The freezing temperatures of Illinois slowly melted away, replaced by the flat, gray highways of Missouri and Oklahoma. I did not have a specific destination. I only had a direction. I needed to move away. Every passing mile marker was a tiny victory against the suffocating gravity of my father's house. But geographical escape requires fuel, and my bank account was an incredibly shallow well. By the time I crossed the Texas state line, my checking balance was exactly $18. The bright orange fuel light on my dashboard illuminated like a warning beacon. My engine sputtered and coughed as I coasted down an exit ramp into the sprawling concrete labyrinth of Austin. The vehicle rolled to a complete stop in the far corner of a massive discount retail parking lot. The engine ticked once and died. I was 22 years old, female, entirely alone, and my net worth was essentially zero. The transition from a brutal northern winter to a sweltering southern spring was violently abrupt. Austin in March is unapologetically hot. The sun beats down with a heavy, oppressive weight that makes the black asphalt shimmer during the daytime hours. The interior of my dark blue car transformed into a literal convection oven. I cracked the windows, but the passing breeze offered absolutely no relief. The cheap fabric seats grew so scorching they burned my bare skin. My first few nights were an agonizing lesson in physical endurance. I tried contorting my tall frame across the cramped back seat, resting my head on a rolled-up hooded sweatshirt. The seatbelt buckles dug deep into my ribs. The stale trapped air inside the cabin made it incredibly difficult to draw a full breath. Living in a vehicle is a logistical nightmare. But being a young woman, living in a vehicle is a terrifying exercise in constant survival. You cannot simply park and sleep. You must calculate every single variable. I quickly learned the complicated, humiliating rules of vehicular homelessness. If I parked in an area that was too dark, I risked being targeted by predators. If I parked in an area that was too bright, the private security guards would inevitably tap on my glass and threaten to call the police. I constantly rotated my sleeping spots between massive retail lots, desolate industrial parks, and dimly lit hospital parking garages. I draped extra shirts over the windows to block the view of anyone walking past. Every single sound outside my car amplified my paranoia. A passing security cart, a group of men talking loudly nearby, the distant wail of a police siren, all of it kept me on high alert. I slept lightly, clutching my car keys between my fingers like a weapon, ready to start the engine and flee the moment a shadow swept across my windshield. The fear was a living, breathing entity sitting right next to me in the passenger seat. Physical survival required immediate steady income. I could not build my software company while starving in a parking lot. I walked 2 miles in the blistering afternoon heat to a low-budget 2-4-hour fitness center. I smoothed out my last crumpled $10 bill and purchased a temporary weekly trial pass. The teenager working behind the front desk handed me a small white towel without even looking up from his smartphone. He had no idea I was about to use his facility as my primary residence for personal hygiene. I walked into the women's locker room, and stood under the scalding shower spray for 30 minutes. I scrubbed away the thick grime of the road, desperately trying to wash off the lingering stench of my father's total rejection. I shaved my legs using a cheap disposable razor and a generic bar of soap I found left behind in a plastic dish. I put on the only clean, pressed blouse I had packed in my canvas duffel bag. I tied my damp hair back into a tight professional bun. I looked at my reflection in the fogged mirror and forced my mouth into a confident professional smile. I had to convince the corporate world that I was a motivated, upwardly mobile college graduate, not a desperate vagrant living out of a trunk. I walked across town to a sprawling corporate office park and sat in a brightly lit waiting room. I filled out a lengthy application for an entry-level data entry clerk position. The hiring manager was a middle-aged woman who seemed chronically exhausted by her job. She briefly glanced at my university degree in computer science and asked why a skilled programmer was applying for minimum wage clerical work. I lied smoothly and without hesitation. I told her I had recently relocated to Austin to immerse myself in the vibrant technology sector and needed immediate steady employment while I worked for better opportunities. She bought the fabricated story completely. She offered me the job right there on the spot. I would earn $9 an hour working Monday through Friday from 8:00 inches the morning until 5:00 inches the evening. The reality of absolute poverty is a grueling, degrading cycle that chips away at your dignity piece by piece. My daily alarm clock was the rising Texas sun, turning my car into a greenhouse. I woke up every morning soaked in stale sweat. I drove directly to the fitness center, swiped my newly acquired membership card, showered, and transformed myself back into a functioning member of society. I spent 8 hours a day sitting in a windowless gray cubicle, mindlessly typing endless rows of alphanumeric codes into a massive, outdated spreadsheet database. It was deeply mind-numbing labor for someone accustomed to writing complex digital architecture. My female coworkers frequently complained about the most trivial daily inconveniences. They whined about the office air conditioning blowing too cold, or the cafeteria coffee tasting bitter, or the morning traffic making them 5 minutes late. I sat silently at my desk, nodding politely, knowing I would trade absolutely everything to have their mundane, comfortable problems. When my shift finally ended, I did not go home to a warm apartment or a home-cooked meal. I returned to my sweltering Honda Civic to count the hours until the sun went down. My daily diet consisted entirely of dry breakfast cereal, generic peanut butter, and whatever heavily discounted canned vegetables I could locate on the bottom shelves of the grocery store. I could not purchase any perishable items because I had absolutely no access to a refrigerator. Hunger stopped being a temporary feeling and became a constant dull ache settling deep in the pit of my stomach. My body grew noticeably thinner. My professional clothes hung loosely on my shrinking frame. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. One particular evening in late April, the temperature hovered near 95 degrees even after the sun disappeared. The humidity was thick and oppressive. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, staring blankly at the illuminated dashboard. My entire body ached profoundly from sleeping on uneven upholstery. My clothes smelled faintly of stale sweat and vehicle exhaust fumes. A man walking a large dog pawed near my front bumper, peering curiously into my tinted windows. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I instinctively raised my keys. Preparing for a physical altercation, the man eventually walked away. But the terror lingered, leaving me completely drained. I felt a crushing, overwhelming wave of defeat wash over my entire nervous system. I had reached my absolute breaking point. I reached into the center console and pulled out my cell phone. The screen was badly cracked, but the device still functioned. I opened my contacts list and scrolled down to the number labeled home. My thumb hovered nervously over the green call button. I closed my eyes and imagined my mother answering the phone on the second ring. I pictured her soft, comforting voice. I imagined the immense relief of hearing a familiar sound. I rehearsed my apology in my head. I planned to beg for a cheap bus ticket back to Illinois. I was entirely ready to promise, surrender my independence, and take whatever miserable factory job my father demanded. I just wanted to sleep in a real bed without fearing for my physical safety. I just wanted to feel secure for one single night. I was completely prepared to surrender my pride for a plate of hot food. But as my thumb pressed downward toward the screen, a distinct, vivid memory violently interrupted my thoughts. I clearly saw my father sitting at the head of that heavy oak dining table. I saw the cold, dead look of extreme disappointment in his dark eyes. I heard the exact cadence of his voice echoing off the stifling walls of my car interior. He called me a drain on the family. He called me deeply selfish. He told me I was a failure who refused to work. The deep sadness resting in my chest instantly evaporated. It was rapidly replaced by a massive surge of pure, unadulterated rage. I threw my cell phone violently onto the passenger seat. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. I refused to let that man win. I refused to crawl back to a house where my presence was considered a toxic burden. I realized in that suffocating vehicle that absolutely nobody was coming to rescue me. My physical survival depended entirely on my own capacity to endure intense pain and manipulate my circumstances. I took the agonizing heartbreak of my sudden exile and weaponized it. I forged that deep emotional trauma into a relentless burning engine of pure spite. The suffocating heat inside the car no longer mattered to me. The gnawing hunger in my empty stomach no longer mattered. The daily humiliation of changing clothes in a public locker room faded away completely. I was going to survive this miserable Texas summer. I was going to climb out of the steel box and I was going to build an empire so massive it would cast a permanent shadow all the way back to Chicago. Every single dollar I earned, every single line of code I wrote became a direct retaliation against the man who threw me away. But my outdated laptop was completely dead and my battery was drained. I realized I could not build a technology company sitting in a sweltering parking lot. I needed electricity. I needed a stable internet connection. And I needed a safe, brightly lit place to work through the dark, dangerous nights. I realized very quickly that the cramped back seat of an outdated sedan offers absolutely zero infrastructure for a technology startup. My aging laptop battery held a charge for exactly 90 minutes. My shattered cell phone could not reliably tether an internet connection. If I was going to write thousands of lines of complex database architecture, I needed a steady supply of alternating current and a stable router. I found my first corporate headquarters on the dusty frontage road of Interstate 35. It was a 2-4-hour diner with a flickering neon sign that buzzed loudly in the damp night air. The interior smelled permanently of burnt filter coffee and heavy frying oil. The booths were upholstered in cracked red vinyl that stuck to the back of my bare legs. I claimed the corner table closest to the restroom hallway because it had a single loose electrical outlet hidden beneath a dusty baseboard. My routine became incredibly rigid. After my soul-crushing shift, entering meaningless numbers at the corporate office park, I drove directly to the diner. I arrived at exactly 60 inches the evening and stayed until 30 inches the morning. I purchased one single cup of black coffee for $1. Whoosher. I nursed that heavy ceramic mug for 9 straight hours. I sipped the bitter liquid so slowly it would turn ice cold by my second hour. The overnight staff rotated constantly. But the primary waitress for my section was a woman named Maria. She was in her late 40s. Always wearing a faded blue uniform and sensible orthopedic shoes. She mentioned during a quiet shift that she worked the graveyard schedule to pay for her daughter to attend a local nursing program. She carried the deep, permanent bags under her eyes that belonged to someone who long ago traded sleep for survival. In the beginning, I was terrified the management would kick me out for loitering. I tried to look busy typing frantically whenever the shift manager walked past my booth. But Maria quickly realized exactly what was happening. She saw my gaunt face. She noticed how my professional blouses swallowed my shrinking frame. One Tuesday night, around midnight, she walked over to my booth and set a massive plate of scrambled eggs, hash browns, and thick buttered toast right on top of my scattered design notes. I panicked. I stammered and told her I could not possibly pay for the meal. She wiped down the edge of my table with a damp cloth, looked me right in the eye, and whispered that the kitchen had cooked an order wrong for another table. She said it was going into the garbage anyway. We both knew the diner was entirely empty. There was no other order. Strangers will frequently hand you the exact grace your own blood relatives violently refuse to offer. I ate that plate of food in 3 minutes flat, fighting back the hot tears welling in my eyes. From that night forward, a mistaken order magically appeared at my booth twice a week. The hot food gave my brain the glucose it desperately needed to function. I dove into the programming with a terrifying intensity. I was designing a sophisticated predictive analytics engine. It was a platform built to ingest massive amounts of raw supply chain data and accurately forecast inventory shortages weeks before they actually happened. It was the kind of complex algorithmic architecture that entire teams of highly paid engineers take years to develop. I was building it completely alone, fueled by discarded diner food and pure concentrated anger. My laptop screen became my entire universe. I created endless relational databases. I wrote complex sorting loops. I spent countless nights wrestling with complex datasets, trying to force my rudimentary hardware to process information it was never designed to handle. I taught myself advanced machine learning protocols by reading free academic journals online. I visualized the entire digital ecosystem in my mind, mapping out pathways and logic gates while I sat staring at the stained Formica table. Every time I encountered a roadblock, I channeled the intense, lingering pain of my exile. I remembered the exact tone of my father's voice, calling me a parasite. I utilized that venom to push through the mental fatigue. I hunted down microscopic syntax errors in the code for hours on end, until my vision literally blurred. I stopped feeling the physical exhaustion. The sticky diner booth transformed into a war room, but the isolation was absolute and profound. The autumn months rolled into central Texas. The oppressive summer heat finally broke, replaced by a crisp, biting wind that made sleeping in my vehicle significantly harder. November arrived, bringing the heavy, undeniable weight of the holiday season. The loneliness was a physical weight pressing against my lungs. During my youth, the holidays were defined by my mother's excessive baking and the warm, chaotic energy of a house filled with relatives. Now, my entire existence was confined to a quiet booth, smelling of stale syrup and bleach. I had no one to exchange gifts with. I had no one to ask about my day. I was completely invisible to the world. On Thanksgiving night, the data entry office was closed. I spent 18 hours straight in my diner booth. Around dinner time, a large family walked through the glass doors. A mother, a father, and 2 adult daughters. They slid into a spacious booth across the room. I watched them laugh together. I watched the mother stroke her youngest daughter's hair, her face beaming with obvious, unhidden affection. I stared at them until my chest physically ached. I pictured my own mother carving a turkey 2,000 m away, enjoying the quiet peace of a house that no longer contained me. I imagined my brother passing the potatoes, stepping smoothly into the void I left behind. I swallowed that bitter pill, turned my eyes back to my glowing screen, and forced my fingers to type faster. My anger served as my only board of directors. It never allowed me to take a day off. It demanded constant, unrelenting progress. The defining breakthrough happened at 2 inches the morning on a random Wednesday in early December. For 3 agonizing weeks, my entire platform had been completely paralyzed by a massive memory leak. Every single time I tried to run a large-scale simulation, the software would freeze, crash, and delete hours of grueling progress. I was on the absolute brink of total despair. I rewrote the core processing loop for the 14th time. I took a deep breath, compiled the code, and executed the testing sequence. I watched the progress bar inch across my screen. 10%, 50%, 90%. It did not freeze. The interface flashed a brilliant green. The engine successfully processed 3 million rows of simulated retail data in exactly 4 seconds. It worked. The algorithm was flawless. I sat back against the cracked vinyl booth. A wild, electric thrill shot down my spine. I was no longer just a homeless girl typing aimlessly in the dark. I was holding a digital asset worth millions of dollars. The narrative of my life violently shifted in that exact second, from desperate survival to lethal corporate ambition. But the universe rarely allows you to celebrate a victory without immediately demanding a heavy toll. Just as the euphoria of my successful test began to set, the cheap plastic cooling fan inside my laptop emitted a loud, horrific grinding noise. The chassis grew dangerously hot against my wrists. The screen flickered violently, turning a sickly shade of digital blue before abruptly shutting down completely. Panic seized my throat like a vice. My entire software platform, my absolute only ticket out of poverty, was trapped inside a failing entwined, low-budget hard drive that was literally melting down. If that physical machine permanently died, I would lose 8 months of grueling labor. I could not afford replacement parts. I could not afford a secure backup server. I realized with terrifying clarity that I had completely run out of time. The neon glow of the diner could no longer protect me. I needed massive amounts of capital immediately. I needed to step out of the shadows, walk into the ruthless, male-dominated world of venture capital, and convince billionaires to hand a young woman living in a Honda Civic a massive check before my only computer turned into a useless brick. The reality of walking into a venture capital firm while secretly living in an outdated sedan requires an entirely different kind of performance. You cannot smell like fear. You cannot let the wealthy investors know that your entire physical existence hinges on their checkbook. You must project absolute confidence sitting across massive mahogany conference tables, pretending you are a highly sought-after asset rather than a desperate young woman surviving on diner scraps. My failing laptop was a literal ticking time bomb. Every single time I powered up the machine to practice my pitch, the plastic cooling fan shrieked louder, warning me that my window of opportunity was rapidly closing. I spent 2 full days at the local public library drafting a comprehensive 15-page pitch deck. I used their free printing services, organizing my complex algorithms into sleek, digestible charts. I washed my only professional blouse in the fitness center sink and dried it under the noisy hand dryer. I tied my hair back into a severe tight bun, hoping to look older and more established. I began cold calling boutique investment firms in downtown Austin. The startup ecosystem is notoriously brutal and heavily male-dominated. It is a closed circuit built on warm introductions, exclusive university alumni networks, and established pedigrees. I possessed none of those things. I was a state school graduate with 0 industry connections, offering a piece of software stored on a melting hard drive. The rejections began immediately, and they were deeply humiliating. I sat in stunning glass-walled offices overlooking the city, pouring my heart out to men in tailored suits who checked their expensive watches while I spoke. The systemic hurdles were massive. as a young woman walking into those boardrooms without a male co-founder. I was fundamentally invisible to them. They looked at my modest clothing and my lack of a corporate background and immediately dismissed my technical capabilities. One managing partner at a mid-sized firm listened to my presentation for exactly 4 minutes before holding up his hand. He was a young, arrogant man who clearly inherited his position rather than earning it. He told me the predictive analytics market was already saturated by established tech giants. He leaned back in his leather chair and patronizingly suggested, "I seek a role as a junior developer at a larger company instead of trying to run my own operation." I walked out of that skyscraper, rode the elevator down 40 floors, and stepped back into the suffocating Texas heat. Every single rejection felt like a direct continuation of that terrible Tuesday night dinner. The wealthy investors used different vocabulary, but the underlying message was absolutely identical to my father's harsh judgment. "You are not good enough. You are a failure. Your ideas are entirely worthless. And you do not belong in this room." I pitched 9 different firms over the span of 3 agonizing weeks. I received 9 identical rejections. My bank account balance dropped below $11. I was eating plain white rice and drinking warm tap water to survive. My laptop shut down randomly twice during my 9th presentation, completely embarrassing me in front of a panel of junior analysts. The lead analyst actually chuckled when the screen went black. I packed up my equipment, walked back to my car, and sat in the scorching driver's seat, completely paralyzed by despair. The heavy, dark thoughts of surrender crept back into my mind. I was one catastrophic hardware failure, away from losing everything. The familiar anger flared up hot and sharp, pushing the despair away. I refused to let those men in tailored suits validate my father's twisted opinion of me. I had one final meeting scheduled on my calendar. It was my absolute last shot before the machine died forever. The firm was smaller, located in a renovated warehouse district on the east side of the city. The founder was a man named Elias Thorne. He did not wear a suit or carry himself with the unearned arrogance of the other investors. He wore dark denim jeans and a plain gray shirt. Elias possessed a unique background. He grew up in a rough neighborhood and built his first logistics company out of a dusty garage before moving into venture capital. He understood supply chain friction because he had actually lived it. He did not care about Ivy League degrees or country club memberships. He only cared about raw, functional talent. I walked into his office. I did not bother opening my carefully printed pitch deck. I did not recite my rehearsed corporate speech. I was running entirely on adrenaline and the terrifying knowledge that my laptop might spark and die at any second. I opened the machine, prayed silently as the fan whirred to life, and launched the core simulation. I told Elias exactly what the algorithm did. I showed him how the software ingested millions of data points and accurately predicted inventory bottlenecks weeks in advance. I did not try to hide my desperation. I laid the raw, unpolished technology bare on his desk. The laptop groaned loudly, the plastic casing growing dangerously hot. Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He did not check his watch. He watched the data cascade across my flickering screen. He asked 3 highly technical questions about the sorting loops. I answered them flawlessly without hesitation. He leaned back in his chair, studying my face carefully. He noticed the heavy dark bags under my eyes. He saw the frayed collar of my only professional blouse. He asked me where my engineering team was located. I told him I built the entire platform alone. He asked me where my office was. I swallowed hard, looking him dead in the eye, and told him my office was booth number 4 at a 2-4-hour diner on the interstate. Elias did not laugh. He did not dismiss me or offer patronizing career advice. A slow, sharp smile spread across his face. He recognized the raw, Feral hunger of a young woman who literally could not afford to fail. He told me that polish can be easily taught, but relentless drive cannot be purchased. He offered me $250. 0 inches seed funding for 20% of my company. I walked out of that renovated warehouse feeling completely weightless. The shift in my reality was instantaneous and violently jarring. 3 days later, the massive funds cleared my newly opened business checking account. I sat in my outdated sedan, staring at the banking application on my cracked cell phone screen. The number possessed 6 digits. I drove straight to an electronics store and purchased a top-tier professional workstation. I signed a 1-2-month lease for a sparse 1-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. The very first night, I slept in a real bed on an actual mattress. My body was so accustomed to the cramped back seat of my car that I woke up 3 times in a cold sweat reaching frantically for my car keys. Within 2 weeks, I officially incorporated the business. I leased a tiny windowless office space in a cheap commercial strip. I hired my first 2 employees, a pair of brilliant, hungry junior developers straight out of a local college. We bought cheap folding tables and plastic chairs. We worked 18 hours a day, fueled by delivery pizza and the thrilling momentum of actual liquid capital. The extreme poverty was completely gone. The physical suffering had ended. But the emotional whiplash was severe and deeply disorienting. I had achieved the exact victory I promised myself I would win. I had proven the arrogant venture capitalists wrong. More importantly, I had proven my father wrong. But as I stood in my new apartment late one Friday night, looking out the window at the Austin skyline, a crushing wave of profound emptiness hit me. The bank account was full, but the internal void was massive. In a normal family, this would be the exact moment you pick up the phone. This is the moment you call your parents breathless with excitement to tell them you finally made it. You share the triumph. You let them celebrate the massive milestone with you. I held my new expensive smartphone in my hand. Scrolling through the empty contacts list, there was absolutely no one to call. There was no one in Chicago who wanted to hear my good news. My success was built entirely as a weapon against them, which meant I could never share the spoils of the war. The realization hardened my resolve even further. If I could not have a family, I would build an empire so massive it would fill the deafening silence. The seed funding was just the beginning. I needed to scale the company immediately, pushing the software into the hands of major enterprise clients. I was completely unaware that our rapid expansion was about to trigger a massive existential crisis. A prominent multinational technology firm noticed our unique algorithm, and they did not want to buy it. They wanted to steal the architecture and crush my fragile new startup, forcing me into a vicious legal and corporate war I was completely unprepared to fight. The multinational technology conglomerate was called Apex Dynamics. They did not actually want to acquire my fragile new startup. They intended to reverse engineer my predictive algorithm and bury me in endless corporate litigation until my seed funding completely dried up. I discovered their malicious strategy during a routine beta test integration. Their engineers had deliberately planted a backdoor script to quietly siphon my core digital architecture. Panic threatened to paralyze my nervous system. But the familiar burning anger immediately took over. I refused to let a boardroom of arrogant, wealthy executives steal the code I wrote while starving in a sweltering diner booth. I needed a lethal legal weapon to fight back. I found her in a cramped downtown office building. Her name was Victoria. She was a brilliant, cutthroat corporate attorney who spent her childhood bouncing between unstable foster homes. She possessed a severe asymmetrical haircut and a complete lack of professional mercy. Victoria understood exactly what it meant to fight tooth and nail for basic survival. We did not play a defensive game. We launched a staggering preemptive legal strike. Victoria filed an aggressive intellectual property injunction and publicly exposed their malicious code injection to prominent industry journalists. We effectively cornered their executive board. The choice presented to them was simple. They could face a devastating, highly public trial, or they could purchase my company for $40 million. They chose the quiet acquisition. I sat in a pristine glass conference room, surrounded by the very men who tried to destroy me. They pushed a thick stack of binding contracts across a polished mahogany table. I picked up a heavy silver pen and signed my name, transferring ownership of the software I created in the back seat of an outdated sedan. In 3 seconds, my financial reality permanently altered. I possessed more liquid capital than my entire lineage had ever conceptualized. I walked out of that building, a multimillionaire at 24 years old. I bought a sprawling luxury penthouse overlooking the Colorado River. The residence featured floor-to-ceiling windows, imported marble countertops, and a complex climate control system that kept the air perfectly chilled year-round. I hired a private tailor to construct a pristine wardrobe of custom wool business suits. I secured a diversified stock portfolio, managed by elite investment bankers. I officially guaranteed that I would never have to calculate the price of a grocery item again. I did not take a vacation. I did not fly to a tropical island to celebrate my monumental victory. The very next morning, I officially incorporated my second technology firm. This new venture focused on enterprise-level supply chain optimization, tackling infinitely more complex data sets for international retailers. I funneled a significant portion of my newfound fortune directly into aggressive expansion. I hired Victoria as my chief operating officer, rewarding her fierce loyalty with substantial equity in the new firm. Within 4 years, my second company grew to employ 200 brilliant data scientists, software engineers, and project managers. We dominated the industry. I evolved into a highly efficient, deeply ruthless chief executive officer. I demanded absolute technical perfection from my staff because I relentlessly demanded it from myself. We operated at a terrifying velocity, crushing smaller competitors and rapidly absorbing their market share. But the underlying architecture of my existence was fundamentally broken. The penthouse was breathtakingly beautiful, but it was completely silent. I built an impenetrable fortress of immense wealth, but I was the sole person allowed inside the gates. I did not date. I did not cultivate meaningful friendships outside of my immediate corporate inner circle. My internal engine was still fueled entirely by the ghost of a retired machinist sitting at a dining room table 2,000 away. One evening, Victoria walked into my corner office carrying a bottle of rare, expensive champagne. We had just closed a historic contract with an international shipping conglomerate. She poured 2 crystal glasses, handed one to me, and suggested we actually pause to celebrate the colossal scale of our growing empire. I looked at the bubbling liquid and then back at my glowing computer monitor. I told her we were already lagging on the next software deployment cycle. I instructed her to save the alcohol for the annual holiday party and get back to analyzing the latest integration metrics. Victoria stopped smiling. She slowly set her glass down on my desk. She looked at me with deep, undeniable pity and quietly stated that building an empire is completely pointless if you refuse to ever sit on the throne. She turned around and closed my heavy glass door, leaving me alone in the quiet hum of the executive suite. Her words echoed loudly in the empty room, highlighting the terrifying emotional cost of my relentless success. My ambition was inherently toxic. I was running a massive corporation responsible for the livelihoods of 200 people, but my daily motivation was entirely vindictive. I realized with a sudden freezing dread that I could never let the anger go. My father's cruel rejection was the absolute foundational brick of my entire empire. I genuinely believed that my childhood trauma was the only variable making me exceptional. I convinced myself that if I forgave him, if I ever allowed myself to feel peace or contentment or genuine joy, The burning fire inside my chest would immediately extinguish if I stopped hating the people who abandoned me. I feared I would lose my sharp competitive edge, and the entire multi-million-dollar operation would come crashing down around me. So, I actively chose the isolation. I deliberately fed the resentment, keeping the wound fresh. I built my emotional walls higher and thicker, locking myself inside a gilded cage of my own meticulous design. I embraced the profound loneliness because it felt incredibly safe. The silence protected me from any further vulnerability. I poured every ounce of my physical and mental energy into scaling the company. I traveled constantly, flying first class to London, Tokyo, and Dubai, securing massive global partnerships. My face appeared on the covers of prominent business magazines. I was lauded as a visionary female founder and a relentless industry disruptor. I accepted prestigious awards and delivered polished keynote speeches to thousands of aspiring entrepreneurs. I projected the ultimate image of a self-made titan who conquered the corporate world entirely on her own terms. Yet every night, I returned to a luxury hotel suite or my empty penthouse entirely alone. I ordered expensive room service and ate in silence, staring at the glittering skylines of foreign cities. The staggering wealth could buy compliance and respect from my peers. But it could not buy a time machine. It could not rewrite the agonizing history of that freezing Tuesday night in Illinois. The extreme psychological pressure of maintaining this flawless, invincible facade required an astonishing amount of daily energy. I could not afford a single moment of weakness. The ghost of my father demanded constant tribute in the form of higher revenue and greater market dominance. I became completely obsessed with controlling every single narrative surrounding my life. This fierce obsession birthed a strict set of psychological rules designed to permanently erase my origins. I was completely unaware that attempting to erase my past would soon mutate into a deeply unhealthy paranoia. I would be forced to construct elaborate, meticulous lies just to survive casual networking events, because the alternative meant exposing the humiliating truth of my exile. The silence from Chicago was deafening, and my methods for coping with that silence were about to become a full-time, grueling psychological war. The psychology of permanent estrangement is a bizarre, terrifying landscape to navigate. When a person cuts ties with their relatives, society generally assumes a dramatic, violent explosion occurred. People assume a singular, unforgivable crime definitively severed the familial bond. The reality of my situation was significantly quieter and far more insidious. My permanent exile did not conclude with a dramatic courtroom battle or a screaming match on a suburban front lawn. It concluded with the heavy, definitive click of a wooden door closing behind my back on a freezing winter evening. To survive the subsequent decade, I had to invent a completely new version of my own personal history. I developed a rigid set of deeply ingrained coping mechanisms, functioning as an impenetrable psychological firewall. The primary rule of my survival was absolute geographic avoidance. The entire city of Chicago simply ceased to exist on my personal map. I refused to route any corporate layovers through the Midwest. If a crucial logistics summit took place in Illinois, I dispatched my senior executives to represent the firm. I deleted all weather applications from my mobile devices because seeing the freezing temperatures of my hometown triggered a visceral panic response in my nervous system. I was currently running a global supply chain empire. But I remained terrified of a single Midwestern zip code. This extreme avoidance created a new complex social conflict. In the elite corporate circles of Texas, small talk frequently revolves around pedigree and background. Wealthy investors inevitably ask where you grew up, where your parents retired, or what your family thinks of your astronomical success. I quickly learned that explaining the honest truth invited a dangerous level of toxic pity. Admitting that a retired machinist threw me into the snow because I wanted to write software invited the unbearable condescension of privileged elites. Those individuals firmly believed all domestic disputes could be resolved with a simple, polite conversation over coffee. I faced a severe test of this boundary during a charity gala in downtown Austin. A prominent venture capitalist named Eleanor cornered me near the bar. Eleanor belonged to a legacy banking family, and she was relentless. She possessed a reputation for aggressively digging into the personal vulnerabilities of successful founders during high-stakes negotiations. She pressed me for specific details regarding my upbringing, noting my distinct lack of Southern charm. I could not show her any weakness. I looked directly into her inquisitive eyes, and I manufactured a tragedy. I told her my parents passed away in a devastating automobile collision shortly after my college graduation. The fabrication flowed from my lips with a terrifying silky smoothness. Eleanor immediately retreated her aggressive posture, melting into awkward apologies. The strategy proved flawlessly effective. More importantly, the deception felt emotionally accurate to my internal state. The people who raised me were effectively deceased. The individuals currently inhabiting that suburban house were complete strangers who merely shared my genetic sequence. However, killing them off in public required me to keep them incredibly vibrant in my own mind. The human brain despises an emotional vacuum. I filled the deafening decade of silence with a highly detailed, fabricated mental theater. I desperately needed them to remain the villains. So I actively imagined their continuous, comfortable success. I pictured my father happily drawing his union pension, spending his weekends restoring small engines in his garage, untroubled by his missing daughter. I envisioned my mother tending her pristine garden baking seasonal pies for local community events without a single trace of maternal regret. I focused a significant amount of this mental torture on my younger brother. I imagined Marcus stepping seamlessly into the role of the favored only child, inheriting the domestic peace I was denied. I pictured him marrying a local woman and hosting a large traditional wedding in our hometown. I visualized my father delivering a proud, emotional toast, raising his glass to the son who stayed behind. I saw my mother dancing with him, her face glowing with genuine joy. I convinced myself they replaced me so thoroughly that my name was never spoken aloud. This vivid mental punishment was absolutely necessary. It prevented me from picking up the phone during my weakest moments and begging for a reconciliation that would ultimately destroy my independence. To justify my grueling 100-hour work weeks, I had to believe they were watching my ascent with bitter resentment. When my face appeared on the front cover of a major international business magazine, I purchased a glossy copy and stared at the printed image. I imagined my father standing in a local grocery store checkout line, seeing his discarded daughter staring back at him from the magazine rack. I needed to believe his jaw tightened with furious, poorly concealed anger. I required that specific imaginary hatred to fuel my corporate machine. If they simply forgot about me, my entire sprawling empire was a meaningless gesture. The profound loneliness of the triumphant scapegoat is an incredibly specific, unique agony. You spend years clawing your way up the sheer cliff face of the highest mountain. You conquer every lethal obstacle you amass. The immense fortune you secure, the lasting legacy. Then you turn around fully expecting to see the faces of the people who doubted you, looking upward in stunned, terrified disbelief. But you look down and there is absolutely no one standing there. You are screaming your undeniable victory into a vast empty canyon. The estrangement eventually manifested physically. I developed chronic insomnia. I would lie awake in my expensive silk sheets, staring at the ceiling, cataloging my corporate assets, just to soothe my racing pulse. The silence transformed into a heavy physical weight, pressing against my ribcage. There were distinct quiet moments when the isolation felt completely unbearable. I would stand on the balcony of my luxury penthouse, looking down at the glittering city skyline. Holding a glass of imported wine, I possessed the liquid capital to purchase entire commercial blocks. I could charter a private aircraft to anywhere on the globe. Yet, I could not purchase the single thing I truly desired. I could not buy a time machine to travel back to that freezing dining room and force those 3 people to choose me. The wealth was merely a sophisticated bandage, covering a deep infected wound. I funneled that lingering bitter sadness directly back into my software firm. I became increasingly demanding, pushing my engineering teams to develop wildly complex algorithms. I launched a massive global expansion initiative that demanded my total relentless focus. I convinced myself that if I could just hit the next soaring revenue milestone, the hollow, echoing feeling in my chest would finally evaporate permanently. I constructed a perfect, impenetrable titanium bubble. I was fully prepared to live the rest of my natural life inside that polished, sterile environment, completely untouched by the messy, painful reality of my former family. I firmly believed my emotional armor was bulletproof. I had absolutely no idea that the silent, comfortable life I imagined for them was a complete fiction. I was totally unaware that my carefully maintained psychological fortress was about to be violently shattered. It happened on a random standard Tuesday afternoon, exactly 10 years after my exile. I was standing in my executive boardroom, negotiating a ruthless corporate acquisition. My defense mechanisms were operating at maximum capacity. I felt completely invincible. Then my private secure phone began to vibrate against the granite table, displaying an incoming call from a 312 area code setting in motion. The absolute destruction of everything I thought I knew. The Tuesday arrived exactly 10 years after my permanent banishment. I was standing at the head of a massive granite conference table inside my executive suite. We were in the final aggressive stages of negotiating a hostile takeover of a regional supply chain competitor. My chief operating officer, Victoria, was projecting quarterly revenue targets onto a sprawling glass screen. I felt completely in my element. I was the undisputed architect of the room. I controlled the temperature, the pacing, and the ultimate financial outcome. The opposing executives were sweating visibly, completely intimidated by my relentless demands. Then my private cellular device vibrated against the polished stone. I never receive unauthorized calls during business hours. My direct line is guarded by multiple layers of ruthless executive assistants who understand that interrupting a negotiation is a terminable offense. I glanced down at the illuminated screen. The area code displayed was 312 Chicago. I silenced the device immediately and returned my undivided attention to Victoria. 30 seconds later, the phone vibrated again, sliding slightly across the smooth granite. I ignored it a second time, keeping my facial expression entirely blank. When it buzzed for the 3rd consecutive time, I felt a strange, highly specific tightening in my chest. True emergency calls possess a distinct frantic rhythm. They do not respect corporate schedules or boundaries. I held up my right hand. The entire boardroom fell completely silent. The opposing executives held their collective breath, waiting for my next directive. I excused myself, picked up the device, and walked out into the thick, carpeted hallway. I stood by a floor-to-ceiling window, overlooking the booming Austin skyline, and pressed the green accept button. I did not offer a polite corporate greeting. I did not announce my name. I simply held the phone to my ear and waited for the intruder to speak. The voice on the other end was incredibly unsteady. It was thin, ragged, and completely stripped of any dignity. He said my name. He told me it was Marcus. Hearing that specific name out loud, after a decade of total silence, felt like walking face first into a solid sheet of winter ice. My brain struggled to reconcile the audio processing. In my fabricated mental theater, Marcus was permanently 19 years old. He was the favorite golden child standing in his heavy work boots, looking away from me while our father threw me out into the snow. The vocal cords speaking to me right now belonged to a 29-year-old man who sounded like he had not slept in a month. I kept my tone absolutely flat. I asked him how he obtained my private number. He let out a dry, hollow laugh containing zero humor. He said he had to track down a junior analyst at a prominent venture capital firm just to find my administrative contact. He then begged my assistant for 3 solid hours to patch the call through. Claiming a catastrophic family emergency, I told him we were not family. I stated that fact clearly, and without a single ounce of venom. It was simply my baseline truth. I was stating a logistical fact. Marcus did not argue. He did not attempt to defend our shared history or demand familial loyalty. He just inhaled deeply and delivered the news like a man dropping heavy stones onto a hardwood floor. He said our father suffered a massive ischemic stroke the previous evening. The local paramedics rushed him to Chicago Memorial Hospital. The neurological damage was incredibly extensive. Arthur was currently lying paralyzed in the intensive care unit attached to a mechanical ventilator because his brain could no longer instruct his lungs to draw breath independently. The tough, resilient machinist was completely incapacitated. I stood staring out the window, watching the tiny vehicles move along the highway far below. I waited for the crushing wave of grief to hit my nervous system. I waited for the panicked adrenaline of a terrified daughter. Nothing arrived. I felt completely detached. The man Marcus was describing sounded like a fictional character from a very old novel I barely remembered reading. I processed the medical trauma, exactly like I processed corporate liability reports. I asked Marcus what he expected me to do with this clinical information. I reminded him that Arthur made his boundaries extremely clear a decade ago, and I had respected those borders perfectly by never returning. Marcus started crying. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was the ugly, desperate sobbing of a human being who has reached the absolute end of his physical and mental rope. It was a sound that made my skin crawl because it sounded so profoundly weak. He apologized for calling. He apologized for interrupting my successful life. But then, he revealed the second layer of the disaster, introducing a massive glaring anomaly into the conversation. He said they were losing the house on Sycamore Drive. The regional bank was initiating formal foreclosure proceedings by the end of the current week. He said they were entirely out of money. He meant literally nothing was left to spend. The savings accounts were completely empty. The union retirement funds were utterly drained. The checking accounts were severely overdrawn, facing mounting penalty fees. He was calling me from a hospital cafeteria because he could not even afford the daily parking garage fee to visit his dying father. My analytical brain immediately rejected the mathematics of his desperate statement. The narrative I had spent 10 years carefully constructing violently clashed with this new incoming data. Arthur was a retired heavy machinist with a robust, guaranteed union pension. The mortgage on that suburban property should have been fully paid off years ago. They lived a frugal, disciplined, blue-collar lifestyle, avoiding luxury and extravagance entirely. There was absolutely no logical reason for a financial collapse of that extreme magnitude. The math simply did not add up. I asked Marcus exactly where the money went. He choked on his words, unable to form a coherent sentence. He said the situation was incredibly complicated, and he could not explain the intricate details over a cellular connection. He begged me to come to Chicago. He pleaded with me to just fly north for 24 hours. Look at the confusing paperwork, and help him understand how to navigate the ruthless banking bureaucracy. He freely admitted that he was not smart enough to fix it. He said he was drowning, and I was the only person intelligent enough to throw him a functioning life raft. The internal conflict that erupted inside my mind was incredibly violent. My initial survival instinct screamed at me to hang up the phone immediately. I wanted to terminate the call, walk back into my pristine boardroom, and continue acquiring competing companies. I wanted to protect the sterile, beautiful fortress I had spent 10 agonizing years meticulously building. Letting Chicago back into my orbit felt like intentionally opening the front door during a Category 5 hurricane. I had worked too hard to build my peace to let them destroy it now. I looked at the banking application on my own mobile device. I quickly calculated the exact monetary cost of making this annoying problem disappear permanently. I could easily wire Marcus $10. 000 right now. I could transfer $50. Ling ling ling. It would not even register on my monthly wealth management report. I could send the funds. Attach a sterile corporate note, wishing them the best of luck and block his number forever. It would completely clear my conscience. It would fulfill any lingering societal obligation of being the wealthy, estranged relative. I actually opened the transfer screen. I typed in a highly generous figure. I hovered my index finger over the green confirmation button. But my finger refused to press down. The mystery gnawed viciously at the edges of my sanity. The numbers simply did not align. The story was fundamentally broken. Why was the beloved golden child begging a ghost for parking garage money? Why was the proud, resilient machinist utterly destitute? My entire empire was built entirely upon my unique ability to identify microscopic anomalies in complex data systems and aggressively correct them. The sudden, inexplicable poverty of my parents was a massive, glaring anomaly. If I wired the cash and walked away, I would never know the actual truth. I would spend the rest of my natural life wondering what truly happened inside that suburban house. After I walked out the front door, I realized that my perfect emotional armor possessed a single microscopic crack. I desperately needed to know if the comfortable, happy life I had imagined for them was a complete lie. I needed to know exactly why they failed without me. The curiosity overpowered the resentment. I deleted the transfer amount. I closed the banking application entirely. I pressed the phone back against my ear. The line remained completely silent, except for the ragged sound of my brother frantically trying to catch his breath. I told Marcus to text me the exact address of the medical facility. I told him I would be on a direct flight by nightfall. I firmly instructed him not to speak to the bank and absolutely not to sign any hospital billing agreements until I arrived on site. I assumed total command of the situation. I terminated the call before he could even offer a single word of gratitude. I stood in the carpeted hallway for 5 full minutes, intentionally regulating my breathing patterns. I smoothed the lapels of my custom blazer. I was not flying to Chicago to be the prodigal daughter, returning home for a tearful cinematic reunion. I was flying to Chicago to conduct a hostile audit. I was going to walk into that hospital, evaluate the wreckage, prove my ultimate superiority, and then fly back to Texas, leaving them to deal with the harsh consequences of their own failures. I walked back into the boardroom. Victoria looked up from her presentation. Instantly sensing the subtle shift in my rigid posture, I instructed my executive team to put the acquisition on a temporary hold. I told them a personal matter required my immediate aggressive presence out of state. I did not know it yet. But the ruthless, confident executive who walked out of that boardroom to catch a flight was about to be permanently destroyed. The fierce, vindictive woman, carrying millions of dollars in corporate leverage, was heading directly toward a horrifying reality, waiting for her inside a locked wooden desk drawer. I secured a seat on the first available direct flight departing Austin. The transition from my climate-controlled executive suite to the airport tarmac was entirely frictionless. My corporate concierge handled every logistical detail, ensuring I bypassed the chaotic security queues and went straight into the premium departure lounge. 2 hours later, I was sitting in a wide leather recliner at the very front of a commercial jetliner. A flight attendant silently handed me a warm towel and a glass of sparkling water before the cabin doors even closed. I held the crystal glass in my hands, feeling the condensation gather against my fingertips. The spatial and environmental contrast was staggering. I was suspended 30 feet above the continental United States, wrapped in an expensive cashmere blanket, voluntarily heading back toward the epicenter of my deepest trauma. The passengers surrounding me in the first-class cabin were casually discussing real estate acquisitions and luxury ski resorts. They spoke the native language of effortless wealth. I had mastered their vocabulary over the past 10 years. I belonged in this elevated atmosphere. Yet, I was actively choosing to descend into the freezing gray reality of the Midwest. I spent the entire 3-hour flight meticulously forging my emotional armor. I was absolutely not flying north to hold hands or offer familial comfort. I was traveling to execute a hostile inspection of a completely broken system. I sat in my luxurious seat and mentally rehearsed the exact tone of voice I would deploy. It needed to be perfectly flat, entirely devoid of any daughterly affection. I intended to walk into that intensive care unit, wearing my bespoke tailored blazer and my imported leather boots. I wanted my physical presence to radiate a level of immense, terrifying corporate power that would instantly crush whatever stubborn pride my father still harbored. I wanted Marcus to look at the fine fabric of my coat and understand that my daily operating budget vastly exceeded his yearly hardware store salary. The lingering bitterness tasted like copper in the back of my throat. I welcomed that metallic taste. It grounded me. It served as a familiar, reliable anchor in a situation that felt dangerously unpredictable. I opened my digital tablet and stared at complex revenue projections, pretending to review the data, but my brain was completely consumed by the impending collision. Every single green arrow on the screen reinforced the impenetrable fortress I had built to survive their absence. The aircraft finally descended through a thick, unbroken layer of dark clouds. The Midwestern winter greeted me the very second I stepped onto the jet bridge. The ambient temperature was hovering near 12 degrees. The brutal wind whipped across the concrete runway, carrying microscopic shards of ice that bit viciously into my exposed skin. It was the exact same unforgiving climate that had frozen my hands 10 years ago when I loaded my canvas bag into my dying sedan. The airport terminal was packed with exhausted travelers, bundled in heavy, damp wool coats, dragging scuffed suitcases across the dirty linoleum floors. The collective fatigue of the city was a physical entity you could almost touch. I ignored the crowded baggage carousels and walked directly to the elite rental car desk. I handed the agent my heavy, solid metal corporate card. I specifically requested the largest, most imposing sport utility vehicle they possessed. The agent quickly handed me the key fob to a massive black imported truck. It was not just a standard mode of transportation. It was a mobile fortress. It was a heavy machine engineered to project absolute dominance on the road. The premium leather interior smelled faintly of rich cologne and new electronics. The heated steering wheel quickly warmed my stiff fingers as I navigated out of the concrete parking structure and merged onto the congested interstate. The powerful engine roared with a quiet, undeniable superiority, easily gliding past older, struggling vehicles sliding on the icy pavement. The drive south toward my hometown was originally intended to be my ultimate victory lap. I had spent countless sleepless nights in Texas, visualizing this exact return journey. I always pictured myself rolling through these specific streets, like a conquering general coming back to survey the ruins of a defeated adversary. I fully anticipated feeling a massive surge of euphoric vindication as I crossed the municipal boundary line into the suburb that expelled me. But as I exited the main highway and steered the heavy black vehicle onto the familiar local roads, the triumphant fantasy immediately began to crack and splinter. The physical environment outside my tinted windows actively rejected my grand narrative. The suburb did not look like the proud, stubborn, working-class stronghold I remembered from my adolescence. It just looked incredibly sad. The commercial strips I used to frequent were completely decimated. I drove past the old diner, where my family occasionally ate Sunday breakfast. The large plate glass windows were covered in warped plywood. The sprawling grocery store where my mother purchased our food seemed shrunken and dilapidated, with several letters missing from its flickering neon sign. The massive metal fabrication plant, where my father sacrificed his physical health for 35 years, was entirely abandoned. The chain-link fences surrounding the factory were twisted and covered in overgrown dead vines. The entire economic foundation of the town had clearly collapsed while I was away building my fortune. I turned the heavy steering wheel and guided the truck onto the residential streets. This was the exact neighborhood where I learned to ride a bicycle. In my youthful mind, these blocks were always imposing and formidable, perfectly reflecting the rigid authoritarian nature of the man who ruled our household. But seeing it now through the windshield of a $100 zero vehicle, the entire area felt dangerously fragile. The houses looked tiny and vulnerable against the harsh, bleak winter sky. The roofline sagged heavily under the weight of accumulated gray snow. The driveways were crowded with rusting sedans and old pickup trucks leaking dark fluids onto the fractured concrete. The aluminum siding on several homes was dented and peeling, revealing the cheap, vulnerable insulation underneath. The manicured lawns, I remembered, were replaced by frozen patches of dead weeds and discarded debris. A deep, unsettling friction took hold in my stomach. The cognitive dissonance was incredibly loud and impossible to ignore. I had spent 10 years building a gigantic, towering psychological monster out of my father and the specific environment that created him. But the physical reality surrounding me right now was simply a decaying municipality struggling to survive an unforgiving economic winter. There was absolutely nothing intimidating left here. There was only rust, fatigue, and slow, steady decline. The staggering realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My monumental anger might be vastly disproportionate to the actual current threat. If this town was so small and pathetic, why was I still allowing its memory to dictate every single decision I made in my professional life? I was a grown woman, wielding tens of millions of dollars in corporate assets, actively gearing up to fight a brutal war against a ghost town. The intense burning motivation that had fueled my entire adult existence suddenly started to feel strangely ridiculous. It felt exactly like bringing a loaded weapon to a cemetery. You cannot demand an apology from a fading memory, and you cannot effectively flex your financial muscle at people who are currently drowning in their own misery. I accelerated away from the residential blocks and headed toward the regional medical district. The towering, brutalist concrete structure of Chicago Memorial Hospital loomed ahead, casting a long, dark shadow over the surrounding intersections. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The confident, ruthless chief executive officer, who smoothly boarded the plane in Texas, was rapidly deteriorating with every passing mile. The closer I got to the intensive care unit, the more I realized my vast wealth offered absolutely no leverage against failing human biology. I was about to walk into a clinical room where my bank account balance meant absolutely nothing to the machines keeping my father alive. The impending confrontation no longer felt like a guaranteed victory. It felt like walking blindly into a trap. I pulled the heavy black truck into the hospital parking garage, the tires squealing against the cold concrete, completely unaware that the decaying town outside was merely a preview of the horrifying physical deterioration waiting for me on the 4th floor. I left the heavy rental vehicle in the cold concrete parking garage and walked toward the main entrance of the medical center. The sliding glass doors parted, and the sharp, bitter wind from the street followed me into the lobby. I bypassed the main reception desk entirely. Having already memorized the wing and room number Marcus provided over the phone, I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 4th floor. The metal box began its slow, Yerki ascent. I watched the digital floor indicator tick upward, feeling a physical weight pressing down heavily on my shoulders. Every single passing second brought me closer to the man who defined my entire existence by banishing me from his. The elevator chimed softly. The metal doors slid open, revealing a long, sterile corridor filled with the rhythmic electronic beeping of cardiac monitors. The environment was aggressively clinical. The harsh overhead fluorescent lights hummed with a low, constant frequency, casting a pale artificial glow on the highly polished linoleum floors. Medical professionals in pale blue scrubs moved rapidly between rooms, holding digital tablets and adjusting intravenous drips. I walked past the central nurse's station, my leather boots making sharp rhythmic clicking noises against the floor. I paused outside the wide glass partition of room 412. My heart hammered violently against my rib cage, sending pulses of adrenaline straight into my fingertips. I squared my shoulders and adjusted the lapels of my tailored blazer. I braced myself to face the towering dictator who had haunted my thoughts for a decade. I took a slow, deep breath, filled my lungs with the scent of industrial antiseptic, grabbed the metal handle, and pushed the heavy wooden door open. The man occupying the clinical bed did not match the monstrous figure I had constructed in my head. The visual disconnect was absolute and instantly paralyzing. My father used to be a physical giant. He possessed shoulders broad enough to block a doorway and thick calloused hands that could easily strip a rusted engine block. The figure trapped beneath the thin white hospital blanket was impossibly small. His skin was translucent, taking on a sickly gray hue that resembled crumpled parchment paper. A thick, ribbed plastic tube protruded from his mouth, connecting his compromised respiratory system to a humming mechanical ventilator. The machine forced his sunken chest to rise and fall with precise synthetic rhythm. His muscular arms had completely atrophied, leaving behind fragile bones wrapped in loose flesh. Dark purple bruises dotted his forearms, where nurses had inserted multiple intravenous lines, delivering constant chemical support. The imposing, terrifying patriarch, who ruthlessly ruined my early 20s, was entirely gone. In his place lay a fragile skeleton tethered to life by a complex web of synthetic wires and plastic tubing. A profound, nauseating wave of cognitive dissonance crashed over my nervous system. I had carried a burning sphere of pure hatred in my stomach for 650 days. I brought that concentrated rage into this specific room, intending to deploy it like a lethal corporate weapon. But you cannot fight a ghost. You absolutely cannot scream at a man who lacks the basic biological capacity to inhale ambient air. My carefully constructed emotional armor suddenly felt ridiculously heavy and entirely useless. The grand, vengeful confrontation I had meticulously staged in my mind evaporated instantly, leaving behind a confusing, gaping void. The vindication I so desperately craved was physically impossible to achieve in this space. I was fully prepared to battle a fierce dragon, but I found a dying bird instead. My vast wealth, my corporate power, and my unyielding independence meant absolutely nothing to the machines keeping his heart beating. I tore my gaze away from the medical equipment and looked toward the far corner of the room. A woman sat slumped in a cheap vinyl visitor chair. It took my brain several agonizing seconds to process the terrifying reality that this person was my mother. She looked 20 years older than her actual chronological age. Her posture was completely defeated, her spine curving into a permanent slump of exhaustion. The vibrant, thick hair I remembered from my youth was shockingly thin and brittle, exposing patches of pale, irritated scalp. Her face was heavily lined with deep canyons of chronic, unyielding stress. She wore a faded, oversized sweater that swallowed her shrinking frame. During my childhood, my mother served as the warm, emotional anchor of our household. The grim reality sitting in front of me was a woman who looked like she had been slowly starving to death in an invisible war zone. She slowly lifted her head, and our eyes met. Her expression was completely hollow, devoid of any spark, warmth, or maternal recognition. She did not stand up to offer a hug. She did not cry out my name. She simply stared at my expensive custom clothing with a blank, detached gaze. As if I were a stranger who had wandered into the wrong clinical ward, her silence was a physical blow to my stomach. A sudden movement near the window caught my peripheral vision. Marcus stepped out from behind a privacy curtain. He did not look like the arrogant, favored son I had visualized during my long, grueling nights in Texas. He looked like a man actively drowning in a very deep ocean. He wore wrinkled, khaki pants and a stained gray hooded sweatshirt. Dark purple circles shadowed his exhausted eyes. His jaw was covered in several days of rough, uneven stubble. He looked me up and down, taking in the imported wool coat, the polished leather boots, and the unmistakable aura of massive corporate wealth. The silence in the room stretched out, becoming incredibly heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the rhythmic hiss of the mechanical ventilator pumping oxygen into our father's failing lungs. Marcus crossed his arms over his chest, adopting a highly defensive hostile posture. He finally spoke, breaking the agonizing quiet. His voice was thick with fatigue and a highly potent layer of unspoken resentment. He told me I actually showed up. I replied that he called my private number and asked for my presence. So I booked the first available flight. I kept my tone carefully neutral, refusing to let any vulnerability slip through my polished facade. Marcus let out a sharp, humorless breath. He stated that I looked exactly like the glossy magazine covers. He pointedly mentioned that my clothing probably cost significantly more than his entire annual salary at the supply store. He accused me of parading my financial success in front of a family that was currently falling apart. I refused to take the bait. I was not going to engage in a petty financial measuring contest next to a man who might not survive the night. I stepped closer to the bed and asked him directly what the neurology team was saying. I demanded a clear, concise medical status update. Marcus ran a trembling hand through his unkempt hair, losing his defensive edge. He explained that the stroke caused rapid hemorrhaging in the left hemisphere of the brain. The surgical team performed an emergency craniotomy to relieve the intense intracranial pressure, but the cellular damage was already extensive. The doctors offered zero guarantees regarding his long-term recovery. They needed to keep him fully sedated and medically paralyzed to prevent any further swelling. I absorbed the clinical data points, analyzing the grim situation. Exactly like a corporate crisis, I asked Marcus what the immediate logistical steps were to secure his ongoing care. Marcus lowered his voice, leaning closer to me so our mother would not hear. The hostility in his eyes shifted rapidly into pure, desperate panic. He explained that the hospital administration required a designated medical proxy to sign the ongoing intensive care agreements. He said a clinical social worker had already visited the room twice, asking incredibly intrusive questions about their insurance coverage and total financial assets. The family checking account was completely empty. The credit cards were all maximizing their limits. The hospital needed immediate proof of funds or a valid insurance policy to continue providing the specialized, life-saving treatments. This revelation sparked a new, intense conflict. My mother sat motionless, completely incapable of navigating complex medical bureaucracy. Marcus was a retail worker with zero experience handling high-stakes financial negotiations. They were paralyzed by the sudden crisis. I possessed the massive resources to solve the problem instantly. But doing so required me to fully step back into the toxic family unit I had spent a decade escaping. I asked Marcus exactly where the insurance documents were located. Marcus shook his head frantically. he said. Our father handled all the administrative paperwork exclusively. Arthur never allowed anyone else to view the financial ledgers or the insurance policies. He was a deeply private, stubborn man who insisted on controlling every single aspect of the household economy. Marcus explained that the necessary documents were stored somewhere inside the house on Sycamore Drive. But he had absolutely no idea where to begin looking. I looked at my mother again. She was staring blankly at the blinking cardiac monitor, entirely disconnected from our urgent conversation. I realized that my presence in this room was making the atmosphere significantly more tense. My wealth, my posture, my very existence was a glaring, painful reminder of their catastrophic failure. I could not stay in this small, claustrophobic space. I needed to separate myself from the overwhelming emotional weight of their physical decline. I turned back to Marcus. I told him I would handle the hospital administration. I told him I would drive to the old neighborhood, enter the house, and locate the necessary insurance paperwork to secure the treatment plan. Marcus exhaled a long, shaky breath. The profound relief washing over his face was undeniable. He reached into the front pocket of his wrinkled pants and pulled out a small brass key ring. He detached a single silver house key and held it out toward me. He told me our father kept a locked, heavy oak desk in his home office on the ground floor. He said the key to open the bottom drawer was taped securely underneath the computer keyboard. I took the cold metal key from his palm. Marcus looked down at the linoleum floor, unable to meet my eyes. He quietly told me the house was in a state of severe disrepair. He warned me that things were significantly worse than I probably remembered. I pocketed the key without offering any verbal reassurance. I turned away from my dying father and my broken mother. I walked out of the intensive care unit, leaving the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator behind me. The grand vengeance I had meticulously planned was completely aborted. I was now acting as an errand girl for the exact people who threw me away. The conflict had abruptly shifted from emotional retaliation to bureaucratic survival. I walked toward the elevator, fully expecting a simple administrative task, completely unaware that retrieving a piece of paper would soon unearth a devastating secret capable of destroying my entire reality. The heavy black rental vehicle insulated me perfectly from the biting Midwestern wind as I navigated away from the medical district. The drive back to Sycamore Drive took exactly 28 minutes. I tracked the slow passage of time on the digital dashboard clock, feeling a strange, hard knot tightening at the base of my throat. Every single turn brought me closer to the physical epicenter of my deepest trauma. The suburban streets were blanketed in a fresh layer of gray slush, making the tires hiss loudly against the pavement. I steered the truck onto my old block and brought it to a cautious halt directly in front of the property. I shifted the transmission into park, but I did not immediately turn off the engine. I simply sat in the heated leather seat and stared through the windshield. The structure standing before me was a complete physical contradiction to the pristine memory I carried in my mind. During my adolescence, this specific property was my father's ultimate source of fierce pride. Arthur treated routine household maintenance as a profound moral obligation. He spent his weekends meticulously scraping the wooden window frames and repainting the trim. He manicured the front lawn with the rigid precision of a military operation. The house used to stand as a formidable fortress, projecting the disciplined authority of the man who owned it. The building I was observing now was actively collapsing under the crushing weight of severe neglect. The roofline dipped noticeably in the center, indicating extensive unseen water damage. The aluminum gutters hung loosely from the eaves, packed tight with years of rotting organic matter. The exterior paint was peeling away in long, jagged strips, exposing the vulnerable gray wood underneath to the harsh elements. The front porch steps were fractured and sinking unevenly into the frozen soil. It did not look like the comfortable domain of a retired machinist who successfully shed his burdensome daughter. It looked like a neglected shipwreck stranded in a quiet residential cul-de-sac. I turned off the ignition and stepped out of the warm cabin. The freezing air immediately whipped against my face, slipping past the collar of my expensive wool coat. I walked slowly up the cracked concrete driveway. There was a dark, sprawling oil stain on the pavement, likely leaking from the rusted older sedan parked near the closed garage door. I pulled the small silver key Marcus had given me from my coat pocket. I climbed the fractured porch steps, inserted the metal into the deadbolt, and turned the mechanism. It required significant physical force to overcome the stiff, rusted tumblers. I pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped over the threshold, sealing myself inside the time capsule of my own exile. The atmosphere inside the hallway hit my lungs like a physical strike. The oxygen was incredibly stale, carrying the unmistakable musty scent of damp plaster, trapped dust, and prolonged isolation. The ambient temperature was shockingly low. I glanced at the analog thermostat mounted on the adjacent wall. The dial was turned down to barely 50 degrees. This was not the environment of a family practicing prudent financial frugality. This was the freezing daily reality of people who were completely terrified of a utility bill they could not afford to pay. I walked slowly into the main living room. The silence was absolute and incredibly heavy. The furniture was the exact same matching set my parents purchased during my high school years. But it was now worn down to the bare threading. The cushions were sunken and severely frayed along the edges. The floral wallpaper my mother once loved was curling at the seams, yellowed by years of cheap heating oil residue. During my childhood, my mother treated this specific room as a sacred domestic sanctuary, keeping it absolutely spotless for guests who rarely arrived. Now it was merely a monument to a slow, agonizing decay. I moved through the arched doorway and stepped into the kitchen. My mother built her entire identity around providing warmth and abundance through food. She was famous in our neighborhood for hosting massive summer gatherings. I pulled open the wooden pantry door, fully expecting to see organized rows of dry goods. The shelves were completely barren. A single box of generic crackers and 2 dented cans of cheap soup sat in the dark corner. The vibrant, abundant matriarch, I remembered, had been entirely erased, leaving behind a fragile woman surviving on the absolute minimum caloric intake possible. A new, stronger conflict began tearing at my analytical mind. The narrative of the thriving golden child and the comfortable retirees was completely dead. The visual evidence surrounding me proved the family plunged into extreme poverty almost immediately after my departure. But the timeline made absolutely no logical sense. Arthur possessed a guaranteed union pension. They carried 0 outstanding debts when I lived under this roof. The sheer, terrifying velocity of their financial ruin suggested a massive, catastrophic event had occurred. A tragedy they actively chose to hide from me while I was busy building my software empire. I turned away from the empty pantry. I was standing directly adjacent to the heavy oak dining table. It was the exact physical coordinate where my life violently fractured 10 years ago. I could almost hear the phantom scrape of stainless steel forks against ceramic plates. I could clearly see the ghost of my father sitting at the head of the table delivering his devastating ultimatum. The psychological weight of the space was suffocating. I had to physically force my legs to propel me forward down the narrow corridor toward the back of the residence. I bypassed the closed door of my old childhood bedroom, keeping my eyes focused straight ahead. I refused to look at the wooden panels. I did not want to know if they had preserved the room as a shrine or transformed it into a neglected storage closet. My ultimate destination was the final room on the left side of the hallway. I reached out and grasped the cold brass knob of my father's private study. This room was his patriarchal inner sanctum. During my youth, I was rarely permitted to cross this specific threshold. It was a space strictly reserved for balancing checkbooks, storing important documents, and projecting absolute unquestioned authority. I pushed the door open. The distinct smell of cheap ground coffee, old paper, and faint motor oil washed over me immediately. The scent was incredibly potent, triggering a visceral memory of my father calculating household expenses with a red ballpoint pen. The study was small and suffocatingly dark. The heavy curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the fading winter sunlight. I reached over and flicked the wall switch. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed to life on the ceiling, casting a sickly pale light over the cramped space. The room was dominated by a massive solid oak desk sitting directly in the center. A bulky, outdated computer monitor rested on the desktop, its screen opaque with a thick layer of grime. I walked slowly toward the desk, feeling a profound sense of trespassing, even with the man lying paralyzed in a hospital bed miles away. His oppressive authority still saturated the very walls of this room. I stood behind his leather office chair. I placed my fingertips against the edge of the wooden desk. I was merely an administrative proxy, instructed to fetch a standard insurance policy to appease a hospital billing department. It should have been a simple, sterile transaction. I reached my hand underneath the plastic computer keyboard, exactly as Marcus had instructed. My fingers brushed against a piece of dry, brittle adhesive tape. I scraped my fingernail against the edge, pulling the tape free. A small, heavy brass key dropped into my open palm. The metal felt strangely warm against my cold skin. I looked down at the heavy bottom drawer of the oak desk. The lock was a sturdy industrial cylinder embedded deep into the wood. A creeping, intense dread began to pool in the bottom of my stomach. The staggering poverty of the house, the freezing air, the empty pantry, and my brother's desperate, panicked tears, all pointed to a singular, terrifying conclusion. The folder I was about to retrieve was not going to contain a simple life insurance policy. I was standing on the precipice of a massive, unexploded bomb. The financial documents hidden inside this locked drawer held the exact timeline of their ruin. They held the answer to why my father stopped maintaining his prized home and why my mother withered into a ghost. I gripped the brass key tightly, wrapping my fingers around the jagged edges. I crouched down, gripping the handle of the bottom drawer, preparing to unlock a secret that would permanently incinerate the entire foundation of my adult existence. I inserted the cold brass key into the industrial cylinder lock, embedded deep within the heavy oak desk. The internal mechanism resisted my initial attempt, groaning against years of accumulated grime and sheer neglect before finally yielding with a sharp, definitive click. I gripped the thick wooden handle and pulled backward with significant force. The metal drawer runners squealed loudly, cutting through the absolute suffocating silence of the dark study. My analytical corporate brain was fully prepared for a pristine administrative encounter. I run a global data analytics firm where critical information is meticulously categorized and instantly accessible at all times. Furthermore, the man I remembered raising me was famously rigorous regarding household administration. Arthur possessed a disciplined, working-class mindset that demanded total structural order. He used to keep his heavy hardware tools outlined with white chalk on a wooden pegboard in the garage. He filed his annual tax returns months in advance, using perfectly labeled manila folders. I fully expected to find a neat professional envelope containing a standard life insurance policy. It was supposed to be a simple, sterile task, representing a final logistical step to close the book on his physical existence. Instead, the heavy bottom drawer revealed a gigantic, chaotic mountain of disorganized paperwork. The documents were not filed alphabetically or sorted by date. They were aggressively crammed into the wooden cavity, bound together by thick, aging rubber bands that had turned brittle and sticky over time. The sheer overwhelming volume of the paper was staggering. I reached into the dark space and pulled out the top stack. The degraded rubber band immediately snapped against my bare fingers, sending dozens of loose pages cascading down onto the faded carpet. I dropped to my knees, sinking into the dusty floor, entirely ignoring the fact that my bespoke cashmere overcoat was gathering decades of dirt. I gathered the scattered sheets, pulling them closer to the weak fluorescent light, buzzing directly overhead. I flipped the first page over, fully expecting to see a standard policy declaration or a recognized insurance provider logo. It was a final notice of default from a major national banking institution. The document was dated several years prior. The bold red ink printed across the top margin demanded immediate substantial payment to halt formal foreclosure proceedings on a predatory second mortgage. I frowned deeply, staring at the terrifying arithmetic printed on the corporate letterhead. The underlying logic of this document was fundamentally broken. My father believed that owning the physical roof over your family outright was the ultimate measure of a successful, honorable man. I possessed a distinct, vivid memory of him severely lecturing a teenage Marcus about the hidden toxic dangers of credit card interest rates. Arthur despised borrowing money. He paid for our modest family vacations and our reliable used vehicles entirely in physical cash. The mere existence of a secondary high-yield loan leveraged against his prized property was completely incompatible with his rigid financial conservatism. A new intense conflict began to form in my mind, rapidly replacing my lingering resentment with profound confusion. The dataset I was actively analyzing contained a massive, glaring anomaly. Human beings do not spontaneously abandon their core lifelong principles without a catastrophic external catalyst. I picked up another handful of papers, pulling them from the drawer and spreading them across the floor like pieces of a horrifying puzzle. My eyes rapidly scanned the dense corporate typography. These were absolutely not insurance policies. They were aggressive, hostile communications from third-party collection agencies. There were final warnings regarding unpaid utility accounts, consolidated high-interest credit card statements, and repeated threatening demands for immediate balance transfers. The arithmetic of their total ruin was entirely laid out on the carpet before me. I sat cross-legged in the dust, systematically breaking the sticky rubber bands and sorting the chaotic piles. As a chief executive officer, I built a sprawling empire by identifying microscopic anomalies in gigantic oceans of data. I approached the disaster exactly as I would approach a fractured corporate ledger. I created distinct columns on the floor. One column for secured housing debt, one for unsecured credit liabilities, and a third for incoming demands. The crumpled documents scattered across this small suburban room represented the most terrifying data set I had ever encountered in my entire professional career. I began piecing the timeline together, sorting the collection notices chronologically. The financial stability of the household remained completely solid and predictable until late autumn of 2015, right around the exact time I was confined to my upstairs bedroom, writing the initial architectural code for my predictive software. The incoming correspondence abruptly shifted from standard, manageable utility bills to astronomical itemized invoices. I dug deeper into the wooden cavity, ripping the remaining rubber bands apart with frantic, uncoordinated movements. The deeper I went, the darker and more terrifying the paper trail became. Beneath the endless banking notices lay hundreds of pages of highly detailed, itemized medical bills. I picked up a dense, stapled packet from a prominent regional medical center. The header displayed rows of complex alphanumeric billing codes. My eyes darted across the columns, rapidly decoding the clinical language. These were not routine physical examinations or standard prescription refills. They detailed extensive, aggressive diagnostic imaging sequences, complex laboratory pathology reports, and massive, incredibly expensive infusions of specialized chemical therapeutics. The basic health insurance policy provided by my father's retired union trust had completely failed to cover whatever experimental aggressive medical protocols were currently required. The out-of-pocket deductibles printed at the bottom of the pages were astronomical. They were staggering figures that could easily bankrupt a wealthy established family, let alone a retired blue-collar worker living in the Midwest. The documents revealed a terrifying story of a man frantically liquidating every single asset he possessed to fight an unwinnable biological war. I found the automated withdrawal receipts, proving he drained his entire protected pension fund, paying massive early penalty taxes just to access the raw liquid cash. When the pension evaporated entirely, he signed the predatory second mortgage, leveraging the absolute only equity they owned. When the home equity dried up, he opened multiple high-limit credit cards, maximizing them instantly on specialized medical transport services and ongoing pharmaceutical co-payments. He did not abandon his fierce working-class pride carelessly. He sold it piece by piece to medical collection agencies. I sat perfectly still on the floor of the study, the dust settling silently around my shoulders. The confident, arrogant narrative I had worshipped for a decade began to disintegrate into ash. The man I hated was not a cruel dictator who threw his daughter away because she lacked blue-collar ambition. The man I hated was a desperate, terrified husband, actively drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of medical debt, trying to buy his family one more week of survival. But a massive, agonizing question remained completely unanswered, presenting an even stronger psychological conflict. If my family was fighting a catastrophic medical illness, why did they violently expel me from the house? In any logical domestic unit, a severe health crisis triggers an immediate consolidation of all available resources. The oldest adult child is naturally expected to step up, secure immediate employment, and contribute to the survival of the household. I was a healthy, highly capable college graduate. I could have easily secured a demanding corporate job in downtown Chicago. I could have handed my entire entry-level salary over to help manage the crushing debt. I could have driven to the hospital. I could have supported Marcus emotionally and financially. Instead, they orchestrated a brutal, unprovoked fight and banished me to Texas, leaving themselves entirely isolated during the absolute darkest period of their lives. The logic was fundamentally flawed. The story was missing a critical variable. I realized I was sitting in my bedroom complaining about internet speeds, while an absolute financial apocalypse was occurring right beneath my feet. I reached back into the empty wooden drawer, running my bare hand along the bottom panel, ensuring I had retrieved every single document. My fingertips brushed against something shoved far back into the very deepest corner, hidden perfectly behind a wooden divider. It felt like a stiff piece of cardboard. The financial documents surrounding me held the exact timeline of their ruin. They held the terrifying answer to why my father stopped maintaining his prized home and why my mother withered into a silent ghost. But the object hiding in the back of that drawer was about to unleash a truth so devastating it would permanently shatter the very foundation of my existence and force me to confront the real, undeniable reason I was thrown out into the snow. I held the stiff piece of cardboard in my trembling hands, feeling the rough texture against my cold fingertips. It was a standard yellow legal pad, heavily creased at the corners and stained with dried coffee rings. The pages were slightly warped, stiffened by years of fluctuating humidity inside the neglected house. I sat cross-legged on the faded carpet of my father's study, breathing in the distinct smell of old paper and stale dust. The harsh fluorescent light buzzing on the ceiling cast a pale glare across the top sheet. The page was covered top to bottom in my father's unmistakable, blocky handwriting. It was not a chaotic random assortment of disconnected thoughts. It was a highly structured, incredibly detailed ledger, documenting the systematic financial dismantling of a human life. I traced my index finger slowly down the first column of handwritten numbers. The dates began in early November of 2015. The initial entries were relatively small. Manageable co-payments and consultation fees paid to a prominent oncology network located in downtown Chicago. But as my eyes moved further down the yellow page, the arithmetic rapidly accelerated into a realm of pure, unadulterated panic. The handwriting shifted drastically from precise measured strokes to frantic, heavy indentations that nearly tore completely through the thin paper. I deciphered the line items tracking the brutal, unforgiving reality of the American healthcare system. There were specific tallies for experimental infusion therapies that the retired union insurance provider had aggressively denied. There were massive out-of-pocket expenses for specialized diagnostic imaging, out-of-network pathology consultations, and daily chemical treatments that cost significantly more than a standard luxury vehicle. To finance this staggering medical offensive, my father began liquidating his entire existence line by line. I read an entry dated December 4th, where he noted the heartbreaking sale of his pristine vintage 1968 Mustang. That specific vehicle was his ultimate pride and joy. A machine he had spent 2 entire decades painstakingly restoring in the garage. He sold it to a local dealership for a fraction of its actual market value, just to cover a single month of my mother's pharmacy bills. A few lines down, I saw a brief note detailing the pawn shop exchange of his grandfather's antique pocket watch. I found the exact date he surrendered his own secondary life insurance policy, absorbing a massive early withdrawal penalty simply to access the raw liquid cash. Every single entry represented a proud, stubborn man actively tearing his own identity into pieces to build a fragile financial raft for his dying wife. The timeline laid out on the pad forced my memory to violently recalibrate. During those exact winter months, I was sitting in my bedroom just a few feet down the hallway, obsessively typing the foundational code for my software platform. I was completely consumed by my own ambition. I remembered complaining loudly about the erratic internet connection. I remembered being intensely annoyed that the house was kept unusually cold. I recalled seeing my mother wearing heavy knit sweaters and winter hats indoors, claiming she was just trying to save money on the heating bill. The terrifying truth hit my chest like a swinging anvil. She was not trying to save money on the utility bill. She was actively losing her hair from the aggressive toxicity of the chemotherapy. She was shivering because her internal body temperature was plummeting from a dangerously low red blood cell count. They were freezing in their own home because they had diverted every single available dollar to the oncology center, and I was too utterly blind, too entirely self-absorbed in my digital world to notice the physical deterioration of the woman who raised me. I flipped the page, the paper crackling loudly in the silent room. The ledger continued documenting the rapid depletion of their emergency savings, the maxing out of their credit lines, and the desperate acquisition of the predatory second mortgage. By late January of 2016, the column of available assets reached absolute zero. I turned to the fourth and final page of the yellow pad. The meticulous columns of numbers stopped abruptly halfway down the sheet. Below the final terrifying calculation, there was a large blank space. At the very bottom of the page, my father had written a dense paragraph using a bright red ballpoint pen. He had drawn a thick, jagged circle around the words, pressing so hard the red ink had bled through to the cardboard backing. I stared at the red text. My lungs stopped drawing oxygen. The ambient noise of the buzzing light fixture completely vanished from my awareness. The note was a private, agonizing confession. It was a strategic blueprint drawn up by a desperate general preparing to commit the ultimate act of treason against his own heart. My father explicitly wrote that the medical debts were going to inevitably consume the entire family. He noted that the bank would eventually take the house, and the collection agencies would seize whatever remained. He then wrote my name, He detailed my upcoming schedule. He knew I was preparing to pitch my software prototype to regional investors in the spring. He recognized the raw, unpolished brilliance of the platform I was building. He finally admitted on paper what he refused to admit aloud, that my intelligence was formidable, but he also understood the fatal flaw in my psychological wiring. He wrote that my loyalty to the family was far too deep. He stated clearly that if I discovered my mother was fighting a terminal illness, I would immediately abandon my tech ambitions. I would drop my code, secure a grueling hourly job at a local logistics warehouse, and hand over every single minimum wage paycheck to help manage the insurmountable debt. The red ink spelled out his absolute refusal to let that happen. He refused to allow the catastrophic illness of one generation to drag the next generation down into the abyss. He wrote that Marcus was already untethered, already working locally and navigating his own simple path. But my potential was too vast to be suffocated by their tragedy. The final two sentences of the note shattered the entire foundation of my adult reality. My father wrote that he had to sever the tether permanently. He stated he must orchestrate a confrontation so brutal and unforgivable that I would leave the house and never look back. He resolved to play the role of a cruel, ignorant dictator. He promised himself that he would make me hate him with such a burning, intense fury that I would use that anger to escape the gravity of their financial ruin and build the empire I was destined to create. I dropped the yellow legal pad onto the carpet. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. A profound, visceral wave of shock radiated from the base of my spine all the way up to the crown of my head. The narrative I had worked for 650 days instantly vaporized into ash. I was not a self-made corporate titan who had conquered the trauma of a vicious rejection. I was the unknowing beneficiary of the most staggering, agonizing sacrifice a parent could possibly endure. The towering inferno of spite that had fueled my grueling nights in the Texas diner, my aggressive venture capital pitches, and my ruthless corporate acquisitions was entirely based on a fabricated illusion. The monster I had spent 10 years running away from the man I had dedicated my entire existence to defeating was actually a guardian standing at the gate absorbing all the incoming fire so I could run free. He had deliberately crushed his own relationship with his oldest daughter, intentionally making himself the villain, just to guarantee my survival. The crushing realization brought an overwhelming flood of toxic guilt. I had spent a decade sitting in luxury penthouses and flying in premium cabins, feeling immensely sorry for myself. I had played the role of the wounded exile, while the man who orchestrated my freedom was slowly starving in a freezing, decaying house, drowning in collection notices and watching his wife fight a brutal disease completely alone. A new fierce conflict erupted inside my chest, replacing the extinguished anger with a desperate, terrifying urgency. The secret was not held by my father alone. Marcus and my mother were physically present at that dining room table on the night of my banishment. They sat in absolute silence, watching me pack my bags. They knew the truth. They endured my 10 years of hostile silence, absorbing my deliberate geographical and emotional isolation without ever breaking their promise to the patriarch. They suffered in the dark while I celebrated in the light. And the only reason Marcus finally broke the silence and called my private number today was because the architect of the lie was lying unconscious on a ventilator. Completely unable to enforce the secret any longer, I scrambled to my feet, my knees aching from kneeling on the rigid floor. I grabbed the yellow legal pad, the medical invoices, and the foreclosure notices, stuffing them haphazardly into the deep pockets of my wool overcoat. The administrative errand was over. I did not need to deliver a sterile insurance policy to a hospital billing department. I needed to deliver a reckoning. I rushed out of the suffocating study, leaving the fluorescent light buzzing in the empty room. I moved through the freezing hallway and burst out the front door into the biting Midwestern night. I ran down the cracked driveway toward the heavy luxury vehicle. Pulling my keys from my pocket, I threw myself into the driver's seat. Starting the engine with a violent twist of my wrist, I slammed the transmission into gear, accelerating away from the decaying house on Sycamore Drive. The tires spun briefly on the hardened ice before gripping the pavement. I was racing back to the intensive care unit, not as a vindictive executive seeking to flaunt her wealth, but as a devastated daughter demanding answers. I was about to confront the remaining members of my family, holding the undeniable forensic proof of their agonizing deception, completely unsure if the fragile bonds between us could survive the explosive collision of this terrifying truth. The psychological collapse was absolute and instantaneous. I remained kneeling on the frayed carpet of my father's study, clutching the yellow cardboard backing of the legal pad. The oxygen in the small room suddenly felt incredibly thin. My lungs hitched, refusing to draw a complete breath. Fatri. 650 days. My entire identity was constructed from a highly specific dense alloy of spite and victimhood. I was the self-made exile. I was the unappreciated genius who survived the freezing wilderness of parental rejection. That narrative was the rigid scaffolding holding my entire corporate empire together. Reading those frantic red ink annotations completely dissolved that scaffolding in a matter of seconds. The foundation was ripped away, leaving me in a terrifying freefall. Tears began to spill over my lower eyelids. They were not the quiet, gentle tears of simple sadness. They were violent, hot, and blinding. They were the physical manifestation of a massive tectonic shift occurring inside my brain. The man I had spent a decade hating. The man whose phantom voice pushed me through grueling nights in a Texas diner was actually a martyr. He had intentionally orchestrated a brutal theatrical performance of cruelty to launch me out of the blast radius of his own financial destruction. A sudden, fierce wave of adrenaline chased away the shock. I gathered the chaotic stack of medical invoices, the collection notices, and the yellow ledger. I shoved the crumpled documents deep into the pockets of my expensive wool overcoat. I bolted out of the suffocating darkness of the study, leaving the front door wide open. As I sprinted down the icy driveway, I threw myself into the driver's seat of the rented luxury vehicle. The engine roared to life. I shifted the transmission and slammed my foot against the accelerator pedal. The heavy tires spun wildly on the frozen pavement before finding traction. The drive back to the medical district was a dangerous blur. Street lights smeared across my windshield, distorted by the constant stream of tears tracking down my cheeks. My hands gripped the heated steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. I navigated the treacherous Midwestern intersections with reckless velocity, completely indifferent to the speed limits. A new agonizing conflict seized my mind as I swerved around a slow-moving snowplow. My father was lying paralyzed in a clinical ward, rapidly running out of time. He was completely unaware that his decade-long deception had just been unearthed. The secret was broken, but the silence maintained by the rest of my family remained a massive, glaring betrayal. Marcus and my mother were active participants in this excruciating charade. They watched me walk out into a freezing winter night with $300 in my checking account, and they never once broke rank. I pulled the sport utility vehicle into the hospital parking structure, bypassing the visitor levels and leaving the car in a restricted physician zone. I did not care about municipal towing ordinances. I sprinted across the concrete deck, bursting through the automated sliding glass doors of the main lobby. The security guard stationed near the reception desk stood up to intercept my frantic approach. But my sheer velocity and aggressive posture caused him to hesitate. I ignored him entirely, jogging toward the elevator bank. The ride up to the 4th floor felt like a geological era. My jaw was clenched so tightly my dental enamel ground together. The metal doors finally parted, displaying the intensive care corridor. I marched past the bustling nurses' station, my leather boots echoing loudly against the highly polished linoleum. I reached room 412 and shoved the heavy wooden door open with enough force to make the metal hinges groan. The atmosphere inside the clinical space was exactly as I had left it. The mechanical ventilator maintained its rhythmic artificial breathing. My mother remained slumped in her vinyl chair, staring blankly at the monitors. Marcus was standing near the window, holding a small paper cup of lukewarm water. They both flinched at my explosive entry. I did not offer a greeting. I walked directly to the foot of the hospital bed. I reached into my overcoat, pulled out the crumpled yellow legal pad, and slammed it down onto the plastic railing. The sharp slapping sound cracked through the quiet room like a gunshot. I pointed a trembling finger at the handwritten ledger. My voice broke on the very first syllable. Completely devoid of its usual corporate polish, I demanded to know why they maintained the lie. I asked them how they could possibly sit at that dining room table 10 years ago and watch me pack a duffel bag. Knowing my mother was actively fighting a terminal disease, my mother gasped sharply. Her sunken eyes darted from my furious expression down to the recognizable yellow cardboard resting on the railing. The stoic, defeated facade she had maintained for years immediately shattered into a million jagged pieces. She covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a deep guttural sob that seemed to originate from the very bottom of her soul. She rocked forward in the cheap chair. Completely consumed by a decade of suppressed agony, I stepped toward her, my anger fighting a losing battle against the sheer magnitude of her physical deterioration. I asked her why my professional potential was deemed more valuable than our family unit. I wanted to understand the mathematics of a mother. Allowing her oldest daughter to believe she was completely unwanted, Marcus dropped his paper cup onto the floor. The water splashed across the sterile tiles. He rushed forward, positioning his body between me and our weeping mother. He held up both hands in a placating gesture, acting as the designated shield. He was the pragmatic sibling, the son who stayed behind because he lacked the soaring ambition that made me a flight risk. Marcus looked me directly in the eye. His face was twisted with a mixture of profound relief and intense defensive anger. He stated firmly that I needed to lower my voice. He told me our father made them swear a blood oath to maintain the illusion of my banishment. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh, challenging the absurdity of a blood oath in modern society. I demanded to know what kind of leverage a retired machinist could possibly hold over his own wife and adult son to enforce such a cruel, prolonged isolation. Marcus did not flinch. He explained the exact mechanics of the blackmail. He said Arthur weaponized his own wife's survival to guarantee my freedom. When the oncology bills began piling up, threatening to consume the house and every available asset, my father recognized that my fierce loyalty would inevitably derail my software career. If I knew the truth, I would have abandoned my algorithm, secured a grueling warehouse job, and handed over my meager paychecks to fight an unwinnable financial war. So Arthur issued a terrifying ultimatum. Marcus recounted the night before the infamous dinner. Our father gathered them in the kitchen and declared that if either of them ever contacted me, if they ever revealed the lymphoma diagnosis or asked me for a single dollar of assistance, he would immediately refuse all further medical treatment. He promised to cancel the chemotherapy appointment, stop filling the pharmacy prescriptions, and simply allow the cancer to consume his wife. The sheer ruthlessness of the strategy completely paralyzed my vocal cords. It was a literal hostage situation. My father held his own wife's mortality over their heads, forcing their total compliance. He engineered a scenario where their silence was the absolute required currency to purchase her continued existence. Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. He said, "Arthur knew my psychological wiring perfectly. He knew my stubbornness rivaled his own. He actively chose to become the villain in my life story because he believed a kid fueled by pure burning hatred would run significantly faster and climb substantially higher than a kid weighed down by familial obligation and crushing medical debt. I looked past my brother, staring at the frail gray skeleton tethered to the synthetic breathing tubes. The terrifying patriarch was a master tactician who traded his relationship with his daughter for that daughter's ultimate prosperity. The revelation forced a new complex conflict to the surface. The terrible truth was finally out operating in the open air. The lingering resentment over being manipulated was fighting a war against the overwhelming awe of his sacrifice. But we were completely out of time for emotional processing. The foreclosure notices were real. The empty bank accounts were a factual reality. The clinical social worker was still demanding proof of funds to continue the life-saving neurological protocols for the man who gave up everything. I had to immediately pivot from being the traumatized victim to acting as the undisputed savior of the family. A role I was completely unprepared to assume while my heart was freshly torn open. The atmosphere inside the intensive care unit shifted instantaneously. The toxic, resentful energy that had fueled my entire adult existence evaporated completely, leaving a fierce protective clarity in its wake. I looked at Marcus and my weeping mother, sitting in those cheap vinyl chairs. I told them the era of hiding and starving was officially over. I turned my back on the mechanical ventilator and walked directly out of the room, heading straight toward the Central Hospital Administration wing. My entire life had been training me for this exact logistical crisis. I was the chief executive officer of a sprawling technology firm, accustomed to managing international supply chain disasters and ruthless corporate acquisitions. Navigating a regional medical bureaucracy was simply another data set to conquer. I located the primary billing department and demanded to speak with the clinical social worker assigned to my father's case. A woman holding a thick laminated clipboard approached the counter. She possessed the exhausted, practiced expression of an institutional employee who was highly accustomed to delivering catastrophic financial ultimatums to desperate families. Her background was undoubtedly rooted in the grim reality of public health care triage. She started explaining standard clinical protocols regarding uninsured patients, utilizing a patronizing tone designed to manage emotional outbursts. She outlined the imminent transfer of my father to a state-funded palliative care facility because the current specialized neurological treatments required substantial out-of-pocket guarantees that my family clearly could not provide. I did not let her finish the rehearsed bureaucratic speech. I reached into my tailored blazer, pulled out a heavy, solid metal corporate credit card, and placed it flat on the laminate counter. I instructed her to cancel any transfer orders immediately. I demanded an emergency consultation with the chief of neurology and requested a comprehensive itemized list of every single outstanding medical debt associated with my parents' names. The administrator stared at the black metal card and then looked up at my expensive clothing. Her rigid institutional demeanor instantly dissolved into compliant urgency. Within 1 hour, the entire trajectory of my father's treatment was permanently altered. I bypassed the standard hospital limitations entirely. I retained a premier concierge medical agency operating out of downtown Chicago. I hired a specialized team of private elite neurological nurses to monitor his recovery around the clock, effectively relieving the overworked hospital staff. I personally met the lead private physician. He was a former military trauma surgeon who had transitioned into high health medical management. He reviewed the clinical charts and immediately ordered an aggressive proprietary therapeutic regimen that a standard retired union insurance policy would never approve. My mother stood in the clinical hallway, watching the sudden influx of elite medical personnel swarming the room. A new profound conflict emerged right there on the sanitized linoleum floor. She approached me with her hands trembling visibly. She tried to refuse the massive medical intervention. She cried, claiming they did not deserve this level of salvation after lying to me for 10 agonizing years. She insisted the specialists were far too expensive and begged me not to jeopardize my own financial stability for their past mistakes. I gently placed my hands on her fragile shoulders. I looked directly into her tired, sunken eyes. I told her the wealth I possessed was earned entirely through the burning desire to survive the exile they orchestrated. I explained that every single dollar in my corporate accounts was generated by the exact sacrifice they made on that fateful Tuesday night. The money did not belong to me alone. It was the direct return on investment for the comfortable adulthood they surrendered. I instructed her to accept the grace she had earned and permanently banish the concept of debt from her vocabulary. She buried her face in my wool overcoat, weeping with the unburdened relief of a prisoner who just realized the cell door was unlocked the entire time. But securing the medical front was only the first battle in a complex multi-front war. The yellow legal pad sitting in my pocket contained a ticking clock regarding the property on Sycamore Drive. The regional banking institution, holding the predatory second mortgage, had scheduled a public foreclosure auction for 48 hours from that exact moment. The next morning, I drove the heavy rented vehicle through a blinding Midwestern snowstorm to the corporate headquarters of the mortgage lender. I walked into the sprawling marble lobby. Bypassing the standard teller lines entirely, I demanded an immediate meeting with the branch vice president. The receptionist attempted to hand me a numbered ticket and directed me to a crowded waiting area. I refused the plastic ticket. I recited the specific loan identification sequence and informed her that a massive wire transfer was contingent upon an immediate face-to-face negotiation. The vice president emerged from his office minutes later. He was a quintessential mid-level corporate banker, wearing an inexpensive tailored suit and projecting a false aura of absolute authority. We sat in his glass-walled office, overlooking the frozen city streets. He pulled up the foreclosure file on his computer monitor. He adopted a patronizing tone, explaining that the legal proceedings were too far advanced to halt. He cited municipal timelines, default clauses, and rigid institutional policies designed to strip real estate assets from vulnerable working-class citizens. I stared at him across the polished mahogany desk. I recognized his specific brand of corporate arrogance because I routinely crushed ambitious executives exactly like him in Texas. I pulled out my cellular device and initiated a secure conference call with my primary wealth management director. I placed the phone on the desk speaker. I instructed my financial team to initiate a direct electronic wire transfer, paying the entire remaining balance of the second mortgage, plus all accumulated penalties and legal fees, immediately in raw cash. The branch vice president watched his computer screen as the digital routing sequence hit his internal accounting systems. His patronizing demeanor vanished completely, replaced by stunned, silent compliance. The bureaucratic red tape that was supposed to take weeks to unravel was entirely incinerated by the sheer terrifying velocity of unlimited liquid capital. I demanded a signed, legally binding document, halting the auction and releasing the property lien. Before I walked out of the building, he scrambled to print the necessary forms. I stood in the bank lobby holding the official release documents. The childhood home was safe. The catastrophic debt that had driven my father to orchestrate my exile was completely neutralized. I walked back out into the freezing wind, feeling a strange, incredible sensation beneath my ribs. I returned to my luxury hotel suite and spent 3 solid hours systematically hunting down every single collection agency listed on my father's yellow legal pad. I authorized direct payments, clearing deeply aged pharmaceutical bills, overdue utility notices, and aggressive credit card balances. In less than 2 days, I completely erased a decade of crushing, inescapable poverty. The money I generated out of pure vindictive spite had become the exact precision instrument of my family's total salvation. The universe possesses a twisted, brilliant sense of irony. I returned to the hospital that afternoon, The elite private nurses had successfully stabilized my father's cranial pressure. The concierge oncologist had reviewed my mother's faded medical files and mapped out a cutting-edge remission monitoring program to ensure the lymphoma never returned. Marcus was sitting in the hospital cafeteria eating a hot meal that I had purchased, looking like a man finally waking up from a decade-long nightmare. Everything was secured. Every financial fire was extinguished. Every medical necessity was provided for in absolute excess. Yet, as I sat alone in the hospital lobby, drinking a cup of bitter cafeteria coffee, a new glaring realization presented itself. Saving the physical house on Sycamore Drive was a logistical victory, but a severe emotional failure. That neglected, rotting structure was a permanent monument to their immense suffering. It was a freezing, deteriorating tomb where my parents had slowly starved themselves to protect my future. Returning them to those peeling walls and sagging ceilings after my father recovered would be an act of profound cruelty. The logic of the situation dictated a completely different outcome. They could not stay in Chicago. The Mid-Albee was a graveyard of broken memories and harsh, brutal winters. I realized my rescue mission was dangerously incomplete. I did not just need to pay off their past. I needed to completely dictate their future. My company had recently expanded operations, purchasing a massive secondary headquarters in the Pacific Northwest. I pulled out my tablet and began browsing the most exclusive residential real estate markets near Seattle, completely unaware that convincing a stubborn retired machinist to abandon his hometown would require a confrontation far more difficult than fighting any corporate bank. When my father finally regained consciousness, the intensive care physicians cautioned us about severe cognitive delays. Their clinical predictions were completely incorrect. The very first emotion that registered across his asymmetrical, drooping facial features was stark, undeniable panic. He realized he was resting in a premier private recovery suite. He observed the elite concierge nurses hovering over his bed, adjusting highly advanced intravenous drips. His functioning hand weakly gripped the expensive linen sheets. He attempted to speak, but his vocal cords were severely damaged by the prolonged intubation process. He locked eyes with me and fiercely shook his head, rejecting the luxurious rescue operation. His working-class pride was deeply offended. He spent his entire existence refusing charity, and now his banished daughter was purchasing his survival. This presented an immediate intense friction. I sat down beside his mattress. I did not raise my voice. I leaned close to his ear and calmly stated that I found the cardboard notebook hidden in his desk. I recited the exact numbers he had written in red ink. I watched a profound, heavy defeat wash over his tired complexion. His stubborn resistance immediately crumbled. I explained that his brutal strategy was a complete triumph. I built the massive empire. I won the corporate war. I told him he successfully completed his mission as the designated villain, and it was officially time for him to retire. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in my life, I witnessed a single tear slide down his weathered cheek. Convincing a proud, lifelong Midwestern man to abandon his frozen hometown required a massive logistical offensive. Chicago was his entire universe, and leaving it felt like surrendering his core identity, but I refused to let them return to that decaying suburban tomb. I purchased a sprawling custom-built property in a quiet, affluent suburb east of Seattle. The Pacific Northwest climate is incredibly mild, offering a permanent escape from the brutal Midwestern winters. The new residence featured completely flat thresholds, extra wide hallways, and a specialized, fully accessible lower-level suite designed specifically for his physical rehabilitation. My mother walked through the towering double doors of that pristine house and completely broke down crying. The kitchen was a vast culinary sanctuary, featuring commercial-grade appliances and expansive quartz countertops. It was a space engineered to revive her dormant identity as the ultimate caregiver, but the transition was entirely jarring, triggering a new psychological hurdle. They were suddenly residing in a neighborhood surrounded by highly paid technology executives and prominent venture capitalists. They felt completely out of place, constantly worrying about tracking dirt onto the imported hardwood floors or using the expensive appliances incorrectly. I had to actively teach them how to inhabit their new reality. I ordered them to scratch the floors, to make messes, and to loudly exist in a space they absolutely earned through their silent suffering. The most complex integration challenge involved my younger brother. Marcus spent his formative years loading heavy lumber and navigating retail shift schedules. He possessed incredible practical intelligence, but lacked any formal corporate polish. I forcibly enrolled him in an elite accelerated business management program at a prestigious local university. I additionally provided him with an entry-level executive position within my analytics firm. During his third week in the corporate office, he walked into my suite carrying a stack of flawed financial reports. He looked completely demoralized. He placed the paperwork on my mahogany desk and announced he was submitting his formal resignation. He stated he lacked the academic pedigree and the ruthless corporate instincts to survive in my high-pressure environment. He firmly believed he was simply a hardware clerk masquerading as a business professional, waiting to be exposed as an absolute fraud. This generated a massive internal test for my leadership capabilities. I could have easily agreed and secured him a quiet, comfortable administrative job entirely out of my way. Instead, I stood up and locked my office door. I told him that academic degrees are completely meaningless compared to raw, enduring loyalty. I reminded him that he stood in a hospital cafeteria and swallowed his immense pride to beg a ghost for help. That specific brand of courage cannot be taught in any university classroom. I demanded he sit down at my conference table, and we spent the next 6 hours manually correcting every single error in those documents together. It is now exactly 1 year after that desperate phone call shattered my isolation. The torrential Seattle rain is lightly tapping against the massive glass windows of my dining room. I am sitting at the head of a long, heavy wooden table. The air is thick with the incredible aroma of roasted garlic, fresh basil, and baked artisan bread. My mother is wearing a vibrant, colorful dress, her hair completely grown back, thick and incredibly healthy. She is laughing loudly at a joke my Chief Operating Officer Victoria just delivered. Victoria attends these weekly dinners regularly, now functioning as an unofficial extension of our rebuilt family unit. Marcus sits directly across from me, wearing a tailored casual shirt, speaking confidently about an upcoming software deployment cycle. He secured a massive promotion last month based entirely on his own analytical merit. And sitting directly to my right, in a highly advanced motorized wheelchair, is the retired machinist who started this entire journey. Arthur is currently engaged in aggressive daily physical therapy. His speech is remarkably improved, though he still speaks with a slow, deliberate cadence. He raises a crystal glass filled with sparkling water. The room goes completely quiet. He looks around the massive, beautiful dining room, taking in the absolute safety and profound abundance surrounding him. Then he turns his head and looks directly into my eyes. There is absolutely no coldness in his expression. The manufactured cruelty of the past is completely eradicated, leaving nothing but honesty. His eyes project a deep, undeniable, and staggering pride. He offers a simple toast, thanking the universe for the family he deliberately tried to push away. I raise my glass in return, acknowledging the immense weight of his gesture. I look at the people gathered around my table, and I realize the hollow, echoing void inside my chest is entirely gone, permanently replaced by genuine connection. I spent my 20s believing that success was a solitary weapon designed to inflict regret on those who abandoned you. I operated under the flawed assumption that true power meant completely severing your personal vulnerabilities. Now I know that is a pathetic, fragile way to exist. The most profound strength a human being can possibly demonstrate is the willingness to become the villain in the story of another person just to guarantee they reach a safe harbor. Sometimes the most agonizing rejections are actually heavily disguised rescue missions. The deepest wounds inflicted by the people we love can occasionally mask their greatest acts of terrifying devotion. They purposefully break your heart, specifically, so you will run fast enough to escape the fire they are quietly burning inside. My name is Julia Hayes. I am 34 years old. The most valuable asset I possess is not my corporate portfolio, my venture capital backing, or my predictive algorithms. It is the noisy, chaotic dinner table filled with the exact people I once swore to destroy. If you made it to the very end of this journey, I sincerely thank you for listening.